Chapter 35. The Red Mountain didn't look far from the top of the mountain, but it was actually quite far away. Gerard and the others walked until night time, but they still didn't reach the Red Mountain. It was just that the Red Mountain had become a lot bigger in their eyes. The three teams rested for another night and continued the next morning. Seeing the Red Mountain in the distance getting closer and closer, Gerard became more and more nervous. He didn't know what dangers awaited him when he arrived at the Red Mountain. He could only pray silently in his heart that his luck would come. As the Red Mountain got closer and closer, they climbed down a mountain and passed through a dense forest. After walking out of the forest, the view suddenly became clear. There were no more trees in front of Gerard and the others, only a barren desert with messy boulders and sand everywhere. In this barren land, it was quiet all around. Even the sound of birds couldn't be heard. As for other creatures, they didn't even see them. And the Red Mountain they saw was not far away. "It's too hot here. It's almost twice as hot as the forest." Seeing the Red Mountain was already in front of them, Gerard wiped the sweat on his forehead and cursed. Gerard thought for a moment and waved his hand to signal everyone to stop. "Let's take a rest first. After a while, we'll rush to the foot of the mountain in one go." After walking for so long, everyone was a little tired. Hearing Master Gerard's words, they didn't care too much and directly sat on the ground and began to rest. Everyone rested for a moment and continued to walk toward the Red Mountain. This barren land was full of thick ashes. When they walked on it, they suddenly brought up thick dust, choking everyone and making them cough. In desperation, they could only tear a piece of cloth from their clothes and tie it to their faces. Only then did they feel much better. Although they were a little breathless, at least they didn't breathe in the dust. Not long after Gerard left, the Gale mercenary group led by Green also arrived. When they walked out of the woods, they saw Gerard's team walking in front of them at a glance. Green was considering whether to walk behind them or go around them. At this moment, the deputy head of the Gale mercenary group, Lowell, quickly came to his side and whispered, "Captain, those people in front seem to be from the Magic Empire as well." Grim nodded. He had noticed this as well. The people of the Magic Empire were different from the people of the Anwu Empire in terms of clothing and appearance. As long as one looked carefully, they would be able to tell the difference. Seeing that Glenn didn't answer his question, Rule continued to ask, "It's so big up ahead. Why don't we take a detour to avoid bumping into them?" Hearing this, Grim could not help but ask, "Why?" Lowell said, "I think that team is just like us. They are also here to explore. If we follow behind them, it will inevitably cause unnecessary disputes. If the other party sees the money, it will be difficult to deal with." Green nodded. What Rule said was exactly what he was worried about. The Fierce Gale mercenary group was only here to scout the path. Or rather, Grim didn't have the confidence that the Fierce Gale mercenary group alone could hunt down a Nightmare Eagle. Therefore, Grim only wanted to find the Nightmare Eagle's foothold safely and then make the money he should make. This was very good. If the loss was not too big, then it would be even better. Grim thought for a moment. In that case, let the brothers take a rest. After a while, we will go around to the other side and walk toward the Red Mountain from that direction. When Mu Hongi and the others arrived, Grim and the others had already gone far away and were going in another direction. Of course, Mu Hongi also saw Gerard and the others in the barren land and began to hesitate. After a while, Mu Hongi decided to go around the people in front of him and walk in another direction. Under the guise of God's domain, Mu Hongi went in the opposite direction from Grim and the others and went around. In this way, the three teams divided into three directions and surrounded the Red Mountain. Walking to this barren land, the three teams were more careful. The three teams had all seen the power of the Nightmare Eagle. They each had their own thoughts and walked toward the Red Mountain. In fact, the three teams had the same idea. Although Gerard was muddling along and did not have much hope, in the depths of his heart, he still had a glimmer of hope. Because if he could really hunt this Nightmare Eagle, then it would be of great help to him in the future. It could even be said that if he wanted to surpass his younger brother in his father's heart, he could only hunt this Nightmare Eagle. Of course, Gerard was also very clear about the strength of the Nightmare Eagle. He also understood that if he wanted to fight with the nightmare eagle directly, there was no chance of winning. It could be said that if he wanted to hunt the nightmare eagle, there was only one way, and that was to poison it. Let the nightmare eagle eat the poison they brought. Only this way would they have a slight chance. Grimm's idea was naturally similar to Gerard's. Although he came to investigate the whereabouts of the nightmare eagle, if he could really hunt the nightmare eagle, Grimm would definitely not hesitate. However, he also understood that if they wanted to hunt the nightmare eagle, the only way was to poison it. There was no need to think about other methods as it was useless. Mu Hongi was even more so. He had already given up on the idea of fighting with the nightmare eagle directly. Instead, he began to consider which method to use the most effective poison. The pitiful nightmare eagle still didn't know that there were already 3 hateful human teams approaching it with 3 types of potent poisons like the Grim Reaper. Mu Hongi and the rest took a long detour until they could no longer see the figures of Gerard and the rest. Only then did they stop and walk towards the barren land. Of course, there was also a thick layer of ash under their feet. Helpless, everyone could only wrap themselves up tightly before they could continue on their way. Gerard, who was walking at the back, looked at the dust in front of him from time to time and cursed in his heart. His shiny chain mail had already been dyed grey by the dust and had lost its usual brilliance. Ah! At this moment, the guards in front of him suddenly let out a cry of surprise. Then, it caused chaos. Gerard was shocked and hurriedly walked forward to see what had happened. Some of the guards in front had already run back. As he ran, he shouted loudly, "Master Gerald, it's not good. There's a tunnel in front." Hearing this, Gerard was even more frightened. He did not bother to answer the guard's words and hurriedly walked in the direction that the guard in front of him pointed. When he reached the front, Gerard saw the scene in front of him and was instantly shocked. He became dumbfounded. Chapter 36. The tunnel in front of Gerard wasn't small. It was 3 meters wide and was more than enough for a person to squeeze in. It was dark in the depths of the tunnel and he couldn't see what was inside. Gerard took 2 steps forward and came to the edge of the tunnel. He looked into the depths of the tunnel but couldn't see anything clearly. He only felt a gust of hot air blowing against his face. After looking at the tunnel, Gerard turned to the guard beside him and asked, "Is anyone hurt?" A guard hurried over and answered, "Master Gerald, one of our brothers fell down." Gerard was shocked when he heard this. He turned to look into the depths of the tunnel and shouted, "Is anyone there? Can you hear me?" Gerard shouted for a long time but didn't hear any response. He suddenly felt uneasy and wondered what would happen to the guard after he fell down. Gerard thought for a while but couldn't figure out what was going on. He turned to the guard beside him and said, "Go down and take a look. See what's going on down there." The guard was shocked when he heard this, but he couldn't resist. He could only walk down the tunnel while cursing Gerard in his heart. Gerard didn't care what the guard was thinking. He only wanted to know what was going on down there and why the guard didn't answer him after he fell down. This underground tunnel wasn't straight up and down. Instead, it was slanted downwards. Although there weren't any stairs, the slanted angle could definitely be used as a staircase. Looking at the guard carefully walking down the tunnel, Gerard was also nervous and uneasy. He stared at the guard. The guard didn't encounter any danger after he went down. He just walked along the slanted underground tunnel and walked towards the depths of the tunnel. Seeing that the guard's figure was about to disappear from his sight, Gerard hurriedly asked, "Did you see anything?" "Master Gerald, I haven't found anything wrong." After the guard finished his words, he completely disappeared from Gerard's sight. Looking at the disappearing guards, Gerard felt more and more uneasy. However, he did not dare to go down to take a look for fear of danger. The only thing he could do now was to wait for the guard to return with news. Although he couldn't see the guard's figure, he didn't hear any sounds of fighting. Gerard felt that the guard shouldn't have encountered any danger. After waiting for a long time, the guard did not come back. Gerard was a little impatient. He waved his hand to the other guard and said loudly, "Let's go. You, go down and have a look. See if there's any danger." The guard who was pointed at by Gerard was so scared that his face turned ashen. He wanted to not go, but when he saw Gerard's expression, he could only curse himself in his heart. Why did he have to stand so close to Gerard? Wasn't that just courting death? However, since things had already come to this, the guard could only walk towards the tunnel with a sullen face. Seeing that the guard walked towards the tunnel, the rest of the guards took a few steps back in unison and tried their best to distance themselves from Gerard. They didn't want to be targeted by Gerard next time. Gerard didn't notice the actions of the guards behind him. What he was concerned about was what was in the tunnel and what had happened. After this guard entered the tunnel, there was still nothing unusual. Just like the previous guard, when he was about to disappear, he answered Gerard and disappeared in front of him. Seeing that 2 guards had already entered the tunnel and didn't return, Gerard felt even more uneasy. Looking at the pitch-black tunnel, Gerard felt a wave of fear in his heart. Not to mention that Gerard was timid. When they first set off, Gerard wasn't timid at all. When he saw the Bear of Earth, he even bravely rushed forward without any fear. However, after seeing the Nightmare Eagle, Gerard was really scared. Fighting with such a magical beast was no different from courting death. If it wasn't for the fact that the Nightmare Eagle didn't want to continue fighting, everyone would have been killed by it. Thinking that these magical beasts wanted to kill him, it was no different from crushing an ant. Thinking of this, Gerard was really scared. Seeing that the 2 guards had disappeared, Carter was a little anxious. Seeing that Gerard was standing there helplessly, he hurriedly walked forward and whispered, "Master Gerald, let me go and take a look." Gerard was overjoyed when he heard this. It would be best if Carter was willing to go. Among these people, Carter's martial arts was undoubtedly the best. If he went down to explore and something happened, then the others naturally wouldn't have to go down. If Carter's exploration was successful, then the benefits would naturally be Master Gerald's. Thinking of this, Gerard tried his best to squeeze out a smile. He patted Carter's shoulder and said loudly, "Carter, good brother, I didn't misjudge you. This time, it's all up to you." Carter nodded and didn't say anything more. He directly took out his large axe and walked into the passage. Following the inclined passage, Carter walked all the way down. He walked very slowly and carefully. Although Carter was now a 5th-level warrior, he didn't dare to think that he was the symbol of invincibility. In the eyes of these young people, a 5th-level warrior was considered quite powerful. However, in the eyes of some people or magical beasts, a 5th-level warrior wasn't even worth a fart. Carter grasped his short axe tightly with both hands, his eyes constantly scanning the scenery in front of him. In front of him, there was only some light coming from the top of the passage. When he looked deeper, it was pitch black and he couldn't see clearly. Just as Carter was about to step into the darkness, suddenly, Gerard's voice came from behind him. "Carter, have you found anything?" Carter shook his head and replied loudly, "I haven't found anything yet." After shouting this sentence, Carter's heart suddenly thumped. He suddenly remembered that the 2 guards had also disappeared after answering this sentence. That was to say, her figure would soon disappear from Gerard's sight. Thinking of this, Carter became even more cautious. The palms of his hands that were holding the axe were already sweaty. He gently let go of one hand and wiped the sweat on his body. After wiping off the sweat on his hand, he switched to the other hand and wiped off the sweat on his palm. Only then did he tightly grasp the handle of the short axe and continue walking into the depths of the darkness. In front of him, there were only a few rays of light shining in the dark cave. Carter couldn't see very far. Chapter 37. The Gale mercenary group didn't encounter any danger along the way. Aside from the dust, nothing else happened. Looking at the Red Mountain getting closer and closer, Green became more and more nervous. Although they didn't encounter any danger, he was still very nervous. The group hurried all the way, bringing up a cloud of dust. But they didn't care too much. Their goal was the Red Mountain in front of them. After walking for half a day, they finally arrived at the bottom of the Red Mountain. The Red Mountain didn't look very big from afar, but when they got closer, they realized that the mountain was not only big, but also very tall. The entire surface of the mountain was covered by some red stones, so when they were far away, they could see that the mountain was a red mountain. Seeing the Red Mountain in front of them, Green immediately ordered a rest and a meal. After all, the next step would be more exhausting. While resting, Green sent out a scout to check the situation of the Red Mountain. Lowell ate his dry food while cursing this damned place. As long as he moved a little, he would bring up a cloud of dust. Not only that, but the dry food was also covered in dust. Seeing this, Green shook his head with a smile. Lowell's strength was needless to say, but his temper was a bit irritable. He walked up with a smile and patted Lowell's shoulder. "Is the dry food mixed with dust good?" Hearing this, Raoul immediately pointed at the dust in the distance and cursed loudly, "This damn place. Why did the Nightmare Eagle choose this place as its residence? Don't you think it's dirty?" While Lowell was talking, a gust of wind blew, bringing up a cloud of dust. When Lowell opened his mouth, the dust fell into his mouth. Lowell was so angry that he kept spitting out dust and cursing loudly. At this time, the scout of the Gale mercenary group came back. "Captain, I found a cave at the foot of the mountain." Hearing this, Green immediately stood up and asked anxiously, "Where is it?" The scout turned around and pointed in a direction. "It's in that direction, not far from us." Before Green could answer, Lowell had already stood up and said loudly, "Captain, since there is a cave there, let's go have a look." Glenn looked in the direction the scout was pointing and asked casually, "Have you finished eating?" When Lowell heard this, he immediately replied angrily, "Eat my ass. There's dust everywhere. How can we eat?" Green turned his head and glanced at the four brothers around him. He found that the expressions on their faces were similar to Raoul's. He no longer hesitated and immediately waved his hand. "Then let's pack up our things. We'll set off immediately to check out that cave." No one wanted to eat in this dusty place for a long time. After hearing Green's order, they immediately put away the dry food and stood up, waiting for Green's order. Seeing that his brothers were ready, Green immediately waved his hand and shouted, "Brothers, let's go." As Green spoke, he took the lead and walked in the direction the scout had pointed out. Everyone else also responded and followed behind Green, walking in that direction. The cave that the scout had mentioned was not far from them. It did not take them long to arrive in front of the cave. Grim looked at the cave and shook his head. His brows were tightly knitted. They were looking for the Nightmare Eagle's residence. They had seen the Nightmare Eagle before, but the cave in front of them was only about 3 meters in radius. With the Nightmare Eagle's huge body, it would be very difficult to enter. This meant that this was not the Nightmare Eagle's residence. Then, was there a need to explore? Looking at the dark passage, Green did not believe that there was no danger inside. He felt that this was not only a dangerous place, but also a very dangerous place. Should they go in or not? Lowell, who was walking behind Green, saw that Green had stopped in front of the cave. He felt strange and hurried forward to ask, "Captain, why did you stop?" Green shook his head and turned his eyes to the other deputy captain, Scott, and asked, "Scott, do you think we should go in?" Scott, who was walking behind Lowell, was also looking at the cave in front of them. After hearing Green's question, he slightly shook his head and immediately said, "I feel that it should be very dangerous here." Lowell heard and immediately shouted, "So what if it's dangerous? We have so many people. Even if we encounter danger, we will be fine." Scott sneered. He had always looked down on this brainless Lowell. "Why didn't you say this when we met the Nightmare Eagle?" Lowell's face turned red with anger. He pointed at Scott and said angrily, "The Nightmare Eagle flies so high. We can't hit it. What do you think we can do?" When Scott heard this, he immediately smiled and said, "You mean, as long as the Nightmare Eagle is on the ground, you can beat it?" When Lowell heard this, he became even more furious. "You're talking nonsense. The Nightmare Eagle can even breathe fire. How can we beat it?" Scott sneered again. He pointed at the cave in front of him and said in a slow voice, "What if there is a magic beast more powerful than the Nightmare Eagle in this cave? What should we do? Last time, it was that boy from the Anwu Kingdom who saved us. Who should we rely on this time? You." When Lowell was about to answer, Green's face changed and he immediately shouted, "Shut up. Don't talk anymore." Green had absolute power in the mercenary group. His words were orders. No one could defy him, including the 2 vice-captains. Scott and Lowell saw that Green was angry and didn't dare to say anything. They could only glare at each other. Green looked at the cave in the distance and listened to the two vice-captains quarrel. His heart was in a mess. Although he had the right to make this decision as the leader, anything could happen in an unknown area. If there really was a magical beast that was more powerful than the nightmare eagle, then the Fierce Wind mercenary group would have no other choice but to be wiped out. Thinking of this, Green slowly turned around and looked at the brothers behind him and said loudly, "We don't know what's inside the cave. If there are even more powerful magical beasts inside, we might be wiped out. For the sake of caution, I've decided that everyone should raise their hands to decide. If you agree to enter the cave, raise your hands. Yes. Now, let's vote. I respect everyone's opinions." Chapter 38. As soon as Green finished speaking, Lowell raised his hand impatiently and said loudly, "I agree to enter the cave." Seeing that the vice-captain had voted, the mercenaries immediately made their own decisions. Glenn looked around and saw that almost everyone had raised their hands. Only Scott and Field hadn't raised their hands. Green looked at them and asked with a smile, "You two don't agree to enter the cave?" Scott nodded and pointed to the top of the Red Mountain and said in a loud voice, "We're here to look for the Nightmare Eagle. I don't think the Nightmare Eagle would be resting in a cave at the foot of the mountain. My guess is that it should be on top of the Red Mountain and not in this cave." Hearing this, Green nodded inwardly. The reason why he appointed Scott as the deputy commander was because of this point of his. Unlike Lowell, Scott would think carefully whenever he encountered a problem. He didn't make decisions based on his own preferences. Scott continued, "Since we can be sure that this isn't the habitat of the nightmare eagles, we'll just be creating more trouble for ourselves if we go in and explore. Not only that, for a creature to be able to survive in front of such a powerful magical beast like the nightmare eagle, I feel that it should be very powerful." As soon as Scott's voice fell, Raoul shouted, "You're wrong. The creatures here aren't necessarily stronger than the nightmare eagle. Look at how small this cave is. Even if the creatures inside aren't strong, the nightmare eagle wouldn't be able to do anything to them." Hearing this, Green looked at Raoul. He didn't expect Raoul to be so good today that he could see this problem. Lowell saw that Green's eyes were full of praise and felt proud. He explained, "It's like a weak mouse that digs a hole and hides underground. Even if a stronger magic beast comes, it won't be able to do anything to it. But do you think we are afraid of a weak mouse?" Ha ha. At the end of his speech, Raoul laughed proudly. Scott looked at the laughing Lowell and continued, "Lowell, you are right. Vice Leader Lowell's words make sense, but our mission is to find the nightmare eagle, not to explore." When Green heard this, he felt a little awkward. Although only Scott and Field objected, their opinions were very reasonable. Grimm also didn't believe that the nightmare eagle would choose this cave as its resting place. In other words, even if they entered the cave to explore, it wouldn't be of any help to their mission. Thinking of this, Green sighed. Since they couldn't make a decision, they should make the decision. "Have you all made your decision?" Hearing Green's question, the mercenaries who had already made their decision answered loudly, "Yes, Captain." Green looked at them again and then turned to Scott. He smiled bitterly and said, "Since everyone has decided to explore the cave, let's get ready and set off immediately." Everyone knew that there was danger in this cave. The mercenaries of the Fierce Wind mercenary group were not fools, and they knew even more. However, what were mercenaries doing? Weren't they just doing missions and adventures? What was the purpose of doing missions? Wasn't it just to earn some money? Although the cave was dangerous, everyone understood that the more dangerous a place was, the greater the profit. Since they had decided to enter the cave, Lowell took out his two-handed axe and walked into the cave first. Lowell was a brainless guy, and the reason why Green was able to become the deputy commander was because of this point. As long as the Gale Mercenary Corps went out to do missions, Lowell would always walk at the front and open the way for everyone. Even when they encountered danger, Lowell never flinched. Looking at the third team, Mu Hongi led everyone to the foot of the mountain and ordered them to rest. Hudaki shook the dust off his body and walked gently to Mu Hongi. "Brother, do we go up the mountain or check it out at the foot of the mountain?" Mu Hongi shook his head. "No need. Let's go up the mountain. I think the nightmare eagle's resting place should be on the mountain." At this point, Mu Hongi turned to look at Hudaki and asked, "Is the medicine ready?" Hudaki nodded. There are a total of 2 kinds of medicine. They are stored well and can be used at any time. After a long while, the team set off again and walked directly up the mountain. Unsurprisingly, they didn't go far up the mountain before they found a cave. Mu Hongi stood in front of the cave and looked at the dark cave entrance. He wondered if he should go in and take a look. At this moment, Shenfeisha had already walked up to Mu Hongi and asked in a low voice, "Brother, do you want to go in and take a look?" Mu Hongi nodded slightly but didn't speak. Shenfeisha saw Mu Hongi nod and knew that he had guessed right. He said, "In that case, let me go in and take a look first. If there is no danger, you can come in." Mu Hongi didn't speak. He just turned his head and looked deeply at Shenfeisha. After a long while, he slowly nodded and said softly, "Be careful. If you encounter danger, don't try to be brave. Quickly retreat and we will think of a way." Shenfeisha saw that his brother had agreed, so he moved his hands and feet a little and then walked into the cave. Shenfeisha's action was beyond Zhong Meng's expectations. He didn't expect that this picky guy would dare to be the first to break into the cave. Although Zhong Meng didn't know what was in the cave, he felt that there must be something powerful inside. Carter carefully held the big axe and slowly walked forward. There was a turn in front. Carter finally understood why the 2 guards had disappeared when they came here. It turned out that there was a turn here. It was just that this turn was in the dark and couldn't be seen from the outside. Carter took a deep breath and grabbed the handle of the big axe with both hands again. He began to walk toward the turn. Slowly, Carter turned the corner and immediately felt a hotter air flow blowing against his face. Although it was still dark in front of him, there were some red rays of light that came out of nowhere and scattered in the darkness. With these red rays of light, although the cave was still very dark, he could more or less see things clearly. At least he wouldn't be in total darkness and couldn't see anything. Seeing this strange scene, Carter became even more nervous. He looked carefully but couldn't see where the red rays of light came from. Just as Carter was looking at the situation in the passage, he suddenly felt his body move. Chapter 39. At first, Carter did not notice this. When he moved his body, he thought he was dizzy. After a while, he was shocked to find that he was indeed moving. Shocked, Carter hurriedly turned around to see what was going on. It didn't matter if he took a look, but the moment he saw it, he was almost scared out of his wits. Not far from his side, a strange-looking thing was opening its mouth at him and sucking in air. Seeing that he was moving faster and faster towards the thing, Carter did not dare to delay. He hurriedly waved his big axe with both hands and rushed towards the big thing. When the big thing saw Carter rushing over, the tongue in its mouth suddenly stuck out and whipped towards Carter at lightning speed. Carter was shocked when he saw this. He did not care about attacking the big thing anymore. He directly waved his big axe and chopped the tongue that was attacking him. The quality of Carter's big axe was good. In addition, his level had increased, so his strength had naturally increased. Under his fierce chopping, the flying tongue was cut off by him. Gu. Gu. After being cut off by Carter, the big monster was not in a good state. It quickly retracted its tongue and screamed in pain. Carter didn't feel good either. Although he had cut off the tongue, the front half of the tongue still hit him, causing him incomparable pain. He let out a muffled groan. Carter took 2 steps back and stabilized himself. He immediately waved his big axe again and rushed towards the monster. The monster was already in great pain after having its tongue cut off by Carter. When it saw Carter rushing towards it, it actually cried out twice, turned around, and jumped into the darkness behind it. Looking at the shadow that escaped in the distance, Carter was a little puzzled. Why did this thing look like a frog? Although the frog-like monster had escaped, Carter still did not dare to let his guard down. He grabbed his big axe and looked around carefully. When he did not find anything strange, he was slightly relieved. Seeing that there was nothing strange in the passage, Carter was ready to chase after the injured frog-like monster. However, just as he took a step out, he suddenly stopped and turned back to the way he came. Ever since Carter entered the passage, Gerard had been extremely nervous. If Carter couldn't come back this time, Master Gerald would definitely give the order to return immediately. Even if there was a mountain of gold in front of him, he wouldn't go. Seeing that Carter had also walked to that dark place, Gerard became even more nervous. He didn't even dare to breathe loudly for fear that it would affect his hearing. This tense state lasted for an unknown period of time. Just as Gerard's eyes were starting to ache, Carter appeared in his line of sight. Carter had just walked back to the ground when Gerard, who had been waiting anxiously, hurriedly went forward and asked, "Carter, my good brother, what happened down there?" Hearing this, Carter thought for a moment before replying. "I didn't see the two guards. I only saw a big monster. After that, I beat the monster away. I wanted to chase after it, but I was afraid that you would be anxious from waiting, so I came back to tell you first." When Gerard heard this, he immediately went forward and patted Carter's shoulder. "Good brother, I didn't misjudge you. You even knew to inform your big brother. Well done." After praising Carter, Gerard suddenly asked, "Carter, what kind of monster did you encounter?" Hearing this, Carter pondered for a moment before replying, "It was quite dark there and I couldn't see very clearly. I could only roughly see that the monster seemed to be a huge frog." "Huge frog?" Gerard couldn't help but repeat. He was puzzled. How big could a frog be? Seeing Gerard's puzzled expression, Carter knew that he didn't believe him. To be honest, if he didn't go down, he wouldn't believe that there was such a huge frog either. "Master Gerald, it was very dark there and I couldn't see very clearly. I could only roughly see. Furthermore, when it escaped, it was hopping away, so I felt that it was a huge frog." When Gerard heard this, he nodded. He thought for a moment before continuing to ask, "According to what you said, how strong is that huge frog? If we go down, will we be in danger?" When Carter heard this, he carefully recalled the battle between him and the huge frog. He thought about how he chopped the tongue with his axe without much effort. It seemed that although the huge frog looked scary, it wasn't very strong. "Master Gerald, that huge frog's defense isn't very strong. I think that if we are careful, there shouldn't be a problem." When Gerard heard this, he heaved a sigh of relief. However, he didn't dare to be completely at ease because Carter's strength was there for all to see. His words were of no value to Gerard. Gerard thought for a moment before turning around and shouting to the guards behind him, "Let's go down and take a look. Everyone must be very careful. Don't let any accidents happen." When Master Gerald gave the order, the guards began to prepare. After a moment, with Carter leading the way and the guards following behind, the group once again walked into the underground tunnel. Master Gerald walked in the middle of the group, which was the safest place in the group. What he wanted now was safety. Under Carter's lead, the group of people quickly arrived at the corner. After turning that corner, they arrived at the place where Carter and the huge frog fought. Carter, who was walking at the front, looked at the ground, then pointed to the ground and shouted to Gerard, "Master Gerald, look, this is the thing that I chopped off." When Gerard heard this, he hurried to Carter's side, surrounded by the guards. When he saw what Carter was pointing at, he couldn't help but gasp. Although Carter had explained it very clearly, when he saw the real thing, Gerard was still shocked. He couldn't help but look around to see if there were any other huge frogs hiding in the darkness. After a while, Gerard calmed down a little. He looked around, waved his hand at the guards behind him, and said loudly, "Split up and look in front to see if there are any other tunnels." The guards responded one after another. They took out their weapons and scattered in all directions to look for the passageway that led to other places. The place where Carter and the others were standing now was like a huge space. They were standing at the edge of this space. As it was very dark here, they couldn't see clearly what was in front of them. They could only look closer. Looking at the guards who scattered to look for tunnels, Gerard's courage increased. Just as he was about to say something heroic to Velanica behind him, he suddenly heard a scream in front of him. Ah! Chapter 40. Just as Gerard relaxed, he heard a scream in front of him. In the next moment, he heard the guard yelling non-stop, "Help! I'm being sucked away by the monster." Hearing his subordinate yelling, Gerard broke out in cold sweat. But he knew that now was not the time to be afraid. The more afraid he was, the faster he would die. Gerard quickly took out his two-handed sword and carefully walked towards the source of the sound. Just then, a figure flashed past him and rushed towards the source of the sound. "Hang in there, I'm coming to save you now." Just as the guard was being sucked close to the giant frog, Carter finally arrived. A white light flashed in front of Carter, and the big axe in Carter's hand chopped down on the big frog's head. After the big frog was severely injured, it immediately screamed and stuck out its tongue to hit the guard in front of it. The guard wasn't an idiot. After the giant frog was hit by Carter's axe, the suction force naturally disappeared. The guard didn't dare to be negligent. He quickly took out his weapon and slashed at the giant tongue that was flying over. But the guard's strength was too weak compared to Carter's. Therefore, when the sword in his hand clashed with the giant frog's tongue, it did not cut off the giant frog's tongue. Not only that, the weapon in his hand was sucked by the giant frog's tongue and pulled back. Seeing this, the guard quickly pulled back with all his strength, trying to pull his weapon back. But the guard's strength was not as great as the giant frog's. The result of the struggle between the two sides was that the guard leaned towards the giant frog again. Seeing this, Carter immediately felt that something was wrong and hurriedly shouted, "Stop pulling, let go and come back." Although Carter shouted urgently, he was still too slow. When the guard reacted, it was already too late. Just as the two sides were pulling, the giant frog cried out again. Then, it spat out a stream of mucus from its mouth and sprayed it on the guard's body. Ah! Just as the mucus sprayed on the guard's body, he screamed in pain. This scream was so shrill that it made one's hair stand on end. Standing behind the guard, Carter heard a sizzling sound coming from the guard's body and felt that something was wrong. He hurriedly used the back of his axe to push the guard back. The giant frog's tongue pulled the guard's sword back into its mouth. It actually swallowed the iron sword into its stomach. After pushing the guard back with his axe, Carter immediately waved his axe and rushed towards the giant frog. The giant frog used the same trick again, its tongue shot out towards Carter. Seeing this, Carter did not dare to delay and hurriedly swung his axe towards the giant frog's tongue. Just like before, Carter's axe chopped off the giant tongue. This time, he didn't hesitate. He waved his axe again and growled. In the next moment, the axe flew out of his hand. With a whooshing sound, it flew towards the giant frog's head. Like a bolt of lightning, the axe streaked across the void and accurately struck the head of the giant frog. Croak, croak, the big frog screamed in pain. Then, it turned around and ran. Unfortunately, it only jumped once before it fell to the ground and could no longer move. Carter looked at the motionless giant frog on the ground with lingering fear. He did not dare to go over and take a look. Although Carter didn't know what the sticky liquid that the giant frog had spat out was, he knew that it was definitely something powerful when he heard the guard's miserable screams. That was why he had thrown the axe out to kill the giant frog from a distance. After waiting for a while, seeing that the giant frog was no longer moving, Carter slowly walked over and kicked it. Seeing that the giant frog was indeed not moving, he reached out and pulled it back into the giant space. At this time, Gerard was standing not far from the guard who was sprayed by the mucus. Seeing the guard screaming in pain, he only felt a chill in his heart, spreading throughout his body. The mucus sprayed by the giant frog was indeed powerful. It did not take long for the guard to be corroded beyond recognition. At this time, Carter had already pulled the giant frog back into the giant space. "Master Gerald, look, this is the thing that ambushed us." Hearing this, Gerard subconsciously took 2 steps back and turned to look at Carter. He saw the giant frog in his hand. Everyone hurriedly gathered around, wanting to see what had ambushed them. Carter was right. What he was holding in his hand was really a big monster that looked like a frog. However, it was a big frog that had been enlarged many times. Gerard asked when he saw the big frog and looked around the 4 square meters. "Do any of you know what this thing is called?" The guards looked at each other and shook their heads. Only a slightly older guard said with uncertainty, "It looks like the underground poison frog." Hearing this, Gerard hurriedly turned to look at the guard and asked, "Do you recognize this thing?" The guard shook his head. "I've never seen it before. I've only heard them say that there is a giant frog-like monster underground called the underground poison frog." Speaking of this, The guard glanced at the giant frog on the ground and continued. The underground poison frog has a poison sac in its body. It's very valuable, so many people are looking for it everywhere. However, there are very few of them, so it's not easy to find them. Hearing this, Gerard was overjoyed. Looking at the giant frog on the ground, he immediately said, "Since that's the case, take a look now and see if this giant frog has a poison sac. If it does, it proves that this is the underground poison frog." Hearing this, although the guards were afraid of the giant frog's poison attack, hearing that the poison sac of the underground poison frog was very valuable, they immediately became spirited. They all took out their weapons and walked toward the underground poison frog. Everyone worked together and quickly found a poison sac in the head of the giant frog. While everyone was ecstatic, they were also secretly glad. Carter had struck the giant frog's head twice in a row. Both times, he had brushed past the poison sac and did not destroy it. That was why the poison sac was intact. Seeing the poison sac brought over by the guard, Gerard was surprised and delighted. Although this thing was very valuable, it was also very dangerous. After the guard was sprayed, he was poisoned to death by the underground poison frog's poison in just a moment. Gerard did not believe that if he was sprayed by the underground poison frog's poison, his ending would not be better than that guard's. Chapter 41. The Gale mercenary group also entered the cave. Lowell raised his mace and walked in front of the group. Although he was reckless, he didn't dare to be careless at this moment. It was pitch black in front of them, and only the warm air was blowing on their faces. It was very comfortable. But why was there hot air blowing out of the cave? What was in the cave? After walking for an unknown period of time, everyone suddenly discovered that there was a trace of red light in front of them. In the originally dark cave, with this trace of red light, they were able to see a little more clearly. Seeing such a strange phenomenon, they didn't dare to let down their guard. Even Lowell, who was always brave, was sweating nervously. As they walked forward, Lowell, who was walking in front, suddenly stopped and said in a low voice, "Wait, there's a sound in front." Hearing this, everyone hurriedly listened carefully. The cave was very quiet. Even if there was a little sound, even if it was far away, if they listened carefully, they could hear it. Lowell's voice was also heard by everyone. It was a strange sound. Squeak. After hearing this sound, Scott turned to look at Green and whispered, "Leader, it doesn't sound like a human's voice." Green nodded. He also heard it. It was indeed a strange sound. Lowell, who was standing in front of the group, thought for a moment, then picked up a stone from the ground and threw it into the depths of the cave. Pa pa pa, the stone hit the wall of the cave, making a series of banging sounds, and flew into the cave. After a while, the sound of the stone hitting the wall disappeared. At this time, the sound they heard increased. Squeak. Gradually, these strange sounds became louder and louder. Everyone understood that these unknown things were rushing towards them. Squeak. These strange sounds were not only getting louder, but also more and more. Hearing these sounds, Green's face became pale. If each sound represented a different thing, then there were probably hundreds of monsters rushing towards them. Green thought for a moment. He knew that it was too late to retreat now. These sounds were very fast. In the time that everyone was thinking, they had already rushed to them. Green knew that he couldn't retreat now. If he retreated, he would leave his back to the enemy. At that time, he wouldn't even have the power to resist. Thinking of this, Green did not dare to be negligent. He hurriedly took out his weapon and shouted, "Prepare for battle immediately." Hearing this, everyone felt even more uneasy. However, their many years of experience as mercenaries told them that if they ran now, they would only die faster. The mercenaries took out their weapons and looked nervously at the dark cave. They were constantly guessing what kind of monster would rush out from the darkness. Raoul, who was standing at the front, was even more nervous. If he had to fight the enemy face to face, even if the enemy was 100 times stronger than him, he would still have the courage to face it. But at this time, no one knew what kind of monster would rush out of the cave. This was the most frightening moment. Suddenly, Raoul's eyes narrowed as he saw a shadow running in front of him. "Is it finally here?" Lowell muttered to himself. At the same time, His eyes widened as he stared at the black shadow. The black shadow ran not far away from Raoul and suddenly became faster. The black shadow was originally running underground, but when it was not far from Raoul, it suddenly jumped to the side of the rock wall, jumped into the air, and rushed toward Raoul like lightning. Seeing the speed of this thing, Raoul was shocked. He didn't have time to think about it. He hurriedly waved the mace in his hand and smashed it toward the black shadow. Although the speed of the black shadow was very fast, Raoul's speed was not slow either. Just as the black shadow was about to rush in front of Raoul, Raoul's mace had already hit it. Squeak! The black shadow suddenly issued 2 screams. Like a sandbag, it was hit by Raoul's mace. It hit the rock wall on the side of the cave and then fell to the ground. Seeing that the thing was not moving, Raoul was about to breathe a sigh of relief. Suddenly, the corner of his eyes twitched. 3 more black shadows rushed out from the darkness. When Raoul saw this, the cold sweat on his forehead suddenly flowed down. The speed of these things was so fast. If they rushed up one by one, it would be easy to deal with them. But this time, there were 3 of them rushing up. At this critical moment, Raoul was not afraid. He hurriedly waved the mace in his hand and looked for the opportunity to sweep from left to right. He was ready to block all 3 targets at once. However, the speed of these black shadows was too fast. Raoul's mace only hit 2 of the black shadows. The 3rd shadow passed through the mace and continued to fly toward Raoul. This black shadow was very close to Raoul. Raoul could already see clearly that this black shadow was like a mouse, but this mouse was much bigger than an ordinary mouse. Raoul wanted to take back the mace to block it, but it was too late. Seeing the scarlet eyes of the big mouse and its sharp claws, Raoul could only sigh. This time, it seemed that it was over. At this critical moment, a boxing glove appeared in front of Raoul. It hit the big mouse like lightning and sent it flying. Seeing that the big mouse was beaten away, Raoul was relieved. As for who saved him, he did not need to look to know. In the whole Fierce Wind mercenary group, only Field used boxing gloves. Raoul did not turn his head. He just shouted loudly, "Thank you, Field." Field replied, "Don't thank me. Look ahead, there are 3 more big mice rushing over." This cave was about 2 meters wide. Raoul and Field stood side by side in the cave, which was equivalent to blocking the entire passage. The rest of the people could only watch from behind. After Raoul thanked Field, he immediately raised the mace in his hand and smashed it toward a big mouse that rushed up. At the same time, he shouted loudly, "Look after your side. Don't worry about my side." Field nodded but did not speak. He suddenly waved his fist and smashed back a big mouse that rushed from the side. Although Raoul's martial arts skills were higher than Field's, especially the mace in his hand, which was more powerful, his mace did not have the advantage here. On the contrary, Field was wearing a full set of gloves, which allowed him to move freely and flexibly in the cave. Chapter 42. In front of the cave, Shunfeisha simply moved his hands and feet, then walked into the cave. It was no different from other caves. Not only was the cave dark, it was also frighteningly quiet. In the entire cave, only the sound of Shunfeisha's footsteps echoed evenly. Shunfeisha had already tried to slow down his pace, but the cave was too quiet. As long as there was a little sound, it would reverberate in the cave. Shunfeisha clenched his fists and carefully looked ahead. Although he volunteered to enter the cave first, it did not mean that he was not afraid. After walking for an unknown amount of time, the light that shone in from the entrance of the passage had completely disappeared, leaving only darkness in front of him. Shunfeisha carefully looked ahead, but suddenly discovered that in front of him, not far from him, there was actually a trace of red light flashing, allowing him to see a little more clearly in this dark cave. Shunfeisha slowly walked forward. Just as he was about to approach the red light, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. In the dark cave, a series of slapping sounds could be heard. Although the sound was not loud, it could still be heard clearly in the tunnel. Shunfeisha stood there and listened for a while, trying to identify what was making the sound. After listening for a while, Shunfeisha gave up. On one hand, he was very far away from the place where the sound came from. On the other hand, the echoes in the passage were very loud. Even if it was a familiar sound, it would not be distinguishable in this passage. Shenfeisha wiped the sweat on his forehead and took a deep breath. Then, he continued to walk deeper into the passage. Shenfeisha walked for a while, and the strange sound became louder. This time, he could hear it more clearly. These clapping sounds were not only messy, but there were also many of them. It was as if something was slapping the rocks on both sides of the passage. Shenfeisha thought for a while. He suddenly bent down and took off his shoes. Wearing only a pair of socks, he slowly walked into the depths of the passage. Without the soles of his shoes hitting the ground, Shenfeisha's walk this time was silent. There was no more movement. In this way, Shenfeisha carefully walked forward, and the messy clapping sounds became louder and louder. Hearing these sounds getting louder and louder, Shenfeisha also became more and more nervous. He could already tell what the sound was. Shenfeisha guessed that the clapping sounds were probably the wings of some birds. The reason why it was so messy was probably because there were a lot of birds. Thinking that it was just some birds, Shenfeisha was a little relieved. In this cave, there shouldn't be any large birds. If it was just some small birds, it wouldn't matter. Thinking of this, Shenfeisha couldn't help but quicken his pace, wanting to see what was in front of him. After walking for a while, the sounds coming from the cave became louder and louder. Shenfeisha could already hear the whooshing sound of those things flapping their wings. Seeing that there was a turn in front of him, Shenfeisha didn't dare to be careless. He took a deep breath and tried to suppress his breathing as much as possible before carefully walking towards the turn. Shenfeisha walked to the turn, but didn't directly walk over. This was because he could already tell that the sounds were coming from the other side of the turn. Shenfeisha thought for a moment and slowly laid down. His head was close to the ground, and he slowly poked his head out to look at the other side of the turn. Shenfeisha's head had just poked out of the turn, and when he saw the scene in front of him, he was suddenly stunned. He almost exclaimed out loud. Fortunately, he reacted quickly and covered his mouth with his hand, so he didn't make a sound. In front of Shenfeisha was a huge space. In this space, there were many bats flying back and forth. These bats were different from ordinary bats. The bats here were all red. Not only that, these bats were very big. Each bat was as big as a bucket. These bats were constantly flying in the space. Sometimes, their wings would beat against the rock walls, making a paa-paa sound. What Shenfeisha heard was this sound. Seeing this scene, Shenfeisha was completely terrified. He really didn't have the confidence to rush in and fight with these bats alone. Shenfeisha held back the horror in his heart and slowly retreated. He wanted to leave the cave first and tell his brother about this matter before making a decision. As for rushing in and fighting with these bats, Shenfeisha wasn't that stupid. It was no different from delivering food. However, it was already too late. The bats didn't rely on their eyes to find people. Shenfeisha had just left the peephole when the bats had already discovered him. Those bats that were close to Shenfeisha began to leave the wall they were clinging to. They flapped their wings and left the wall, flying towards Shenfeisha. Not only that, more and more bats discovered Shenfeisha and began to fly towards him. Seeing this, Shenfeisha's heart cried out. He no longer cared about hiding. He hurriedly jumped up from the ground and ran back the way he came. Shenfeisha, who was running for his life, could only hear the sound of wings flapping behind him. The sound of wings hitting the rock walls of the tunnel was getting louder and louder. At this moment, Shenfeisha was really scared. He knew that if he was caught by these bats, it wouldn't be long before he wouldn't even have bones left. Shenfeisha ran for his life, not daring to stop for a moment. Although there was a weak red light in the cave, it was still very dark. Several times, because of his fast speed, he hit the rock walls, causing him incomparable pain. But at this moment, these small injuries, he couldn't care less. He only had one thought now, and that was to run out of the cave and he would be safe. Although Shenfeisha thought very well, but the bat's flying speed was far faster than him. Shenfeisha didn't run a few steps before he felt a gust of wind behind him. Then, he felt pain on his back. Shenfeisha groaned in pain. He felt that the bats should have bitten him. But he didn't dare to stop. He didn't even dare to look back. Instead, he increased his strength and ran towards the cave entrance. Although Shenfeisha sped up, His speed was still not as fast as the bat's flying speed. After running a few steps, he felt pain on his back. He was attacked by the bats. Then, more bats chased over and attacked Shinfeisha's back. Shinfeisha only felt pain coming from his back. The pain made his legs go soft. But he still endured it. His footsteps didn't stop at all. He still used all his strength to run out. Suddenly, Shinfeisha, who was running for his life, felt pain on his head. He knew that his head was also attacked. Chapter 43. After Shinfeisha was attacked by the big bat, he only felt his vision go black. The pain was so painful that he almost fell to the ground. Not only that, the bat that attacked him from behind actually grabbed him tightly. No matter how Shinfeisha shook his head, he couldn't get rid of its claws. Looking at the constantly flashing little stars in front of him, Shinfeisha suddenly roared and temporarily flashed those little stars away. He suddenly stretched out his hand and grabbed the big bat behind his head. He forcefully pulled forward, enduring the intense pain, and pulled the bat down. In this short period of time, several bats attacked him, but Shinfeisha couldn't care less. Now he could only escape. There was still a chance of survival. If he dared to stop now, then he wouldn't be able to get out alive. Shinfeisha's efforts were still very useful. After a period of frantic running, he finally saw the shining light of hope at the entrance of the cave. Looking at the white light coming from the cave, Shinfeisha suddenly found that the pain that was attacking him like raindrops had disappeared. Not only that, as he got closer and closer to the entrance, the sound of wings flapping behind him also got farther and farther away. Shinfeisha was suddenly ecstatic. He knew that he was saved. At this moment, the big bat in his hand suddenly let out a series of screams. The bat couldn't help but move, trying to get out of Shinfeisha's control. When the big bats saw the light, they all retreated into the dark space. Without the attacks of these big bats, Shinfeisha slowed down a little and staggered out of the cave. Everyone who had been waiting outside anxiously saw a figure running out of the cave after an unknown amount of time. As soon as he got out of the cave, the man fell to the ground. When everyone saw who it was, they were all shocked and hurriedly surrounded him. "Old Five, what's wrong with you? How did you get so many injuries? What happened?" Shinfeisha, who was lying on the ground, heard Mu Hongyi's question and reluctantly raised his head and answered, "Big brother, there are a lot of these things in the cave." As he spoke, Shinfeisha raised the big bat in his hand. Mu Hongyi grabbed the big bat. With just a glance, a trace of horror appeared in his eyes. Is this a bat?" Hudaki nodded. "Big brother, it's more important to treat Old Five's injuries first." Hearing this, Mu Hongyi reacted and began to check Shinfeisha's injuries. Shinfeisha's injuries were almost too horrible to look at. His back and the back of his head had been attacked by the giant bat. It could be said that there was no place on his back that was still intact. Looking at the injury on Shinfeisha's back, Mu Hongyi's face was a little pale. He sighed weakly. "Old Five's injury is so serious, but we've run out of medicine. What should we do?" Hearing this, everyone remembered that the medicine that Mu Hongyi and the others had brought had all been used up to treat Shinshowu and the others. Seeing that Shinfeisha's injuries were so serious, but there was no medicine to treat his injuries, Mu Hongyi and the other 4 people couldn't help but look at each other. At this moment, one of Zhong Qiuming's men suddenly stepped forward and whispered, "I also have some ordinary hemostatic drugs here, is that okay?" Hearing this, Mu Hongyi was overjoyed. He immediately stretched out his hand and said loudly, "Then what are you waiting for? Hurry up and take it out." Zhong Qiuming's guard quickly took out the hemostatic drugs and handed them over. Hudaki hurriedly reached out and took it. "Big brother, let me apply the medicine for Old Five." Mu Hongyi nodded and said eagerly, "Then hurry up." Hudaki didn't dare to be negligent. He hurriedly walked to Shinfeisha's side and began to apply the medicine for him. The medicine that Mu Hongyi and the others had brought was all good medicine. Not only could it stop bleeding, but it could also treat injuries and restore vitality. However, the hemostatic drugs that this person had taken out only had the effect of stopping bleeding and had no effect of treating injuries. Zhong Meng was also shocked when he saw Shinfeisha's miserable appearance. When he saw the big bat in Mu Hongyi's hand, he was even more shocked. He had seen bats before, but he had never seen such a big bat before. Moreover, it was this kind of red bat, which was even more unprecedented. The red bat in Mu Hongyi's hand had an abnormally ferocious appearance. Its black melon seeds flashed a cold light under the sunlight, making people absolutely not dare to underestimate the power of its claws. As the big bat kept screaming, Zhong Meng could clearly see that the sharp teeth in its mouth were like daggers, which were abnormally sharp. Zhong Meng knew that bats lived in groups. This time, Shenfeisha had entered the passage. He might have broken into a bat's nest and let these ferocious big bats have a meal. Zhong Meng saw that Mu Hongyi's eyes were fixed on the red bat. He couldn't help but go over and ask, "Lord Mu, what is this thing?" Mu Hongyi shook his head. "It looks like a bat, but I've never seen such a big bat. I've never even heard of it. Not only that, this bat is actually red. It's really rare." At this moment, Fan Shouwu suddenly came over. He cupped his fists towards Mu Hongyi and said, "Lord Mu, can you let me see this big bat?" Mu Hongyi nodded and handed over the big bat in his hand. Fan Shouwu carefully took the bat and kept turning it back and forth in his hand. After a long while, he slowly said, "I once saw an introduction in an ancient book. In the depths of the earth, there is often some magma, and near this magma, there is a kind of bat that is not afraid of fire. According to the ancient book, this kind of bat is called a fire bat." Speaking of this, Fan Shouwu carefully looked at the bat in his hand and shook his head. This bat is somewhat similar to the fire bat recorded in the ancient book, but there are some differences. Hearing this, Mu Hongyi hurriedly asked, "What's the difference?" Fan Shouwu looked at the big bat in his hand and said with some doubts, "According to the records in those ancient books, those fire bats have the power of fire element and can spit out some very small fireballs. Although these fireballs are not very powerful, hundreds or thousands of fire bats spitting out fireballs at the same time is still quite powerful." Speaking of this, Fan Shouwu raised the big bat in his hand and said to Mu Hongyi, "Lord Mu, look, this big bat has the same appearance as the fire bat, but it doesn't have the ability to spit out fireball. This is somewhat different from the fire bat recorded in the ancient book." Mu Hongyi looked at the big bat in Fan Shouwu's hand and suddenly turned around to look at Shenfeisha lying on the ground and asked loudly. Chapter 44. Mu Hongyi looked at Shenfeisha and asked, "Old Five, you heard young Master Shen's words, right? Did these big bats spit out fireballs just now?" Shenfeisha thought for a moment, then shook his head and said in a hoarse voice, "No, I didn't see these big bats spit out fireballs." Fan Shouwu heard this and muttered to himself, "This is a bit strange. These big bats look the same as described in the ancient books, but why don't they spit out fireballs?" Mu Hongyi and Shen Shouwu discussed for a long time, but still couldn't figure out the reason. In the end, they could only give up. Seeing that Hudaki had finished applying medicine to Shenfeisha, Mu Hongyi slowly walked in front of Shenfeisha and asked, "Old Five, tell us in detail. What exactly happened inside?" Shenfeisha listened to his big brother's question and recounted his experience after entering the cave in detail. He also emphasized the situation in the innermost space, and finally added, "Big brother, there are really a lot of bats in that space. The entire space is full of these big bats." Speaking of this, a trace of fear appeared on Shenfeisha's face again. Looking at the fear on Shenfeisha's face, Mu Hongyi didn't think that he was timid. Even after listening to Shenfeisha's words, his heart turned cold. Looking at the cave in front of him, Mu Hongyi sighed. He turned his head to look at the crowd and said sternly, "Everyone heard Old Five's words just now, so I've decided to wait for a while. A few of my brothers and I will enter the cave. The rest of you will wait outside for news." Fan Shouwu heard this and hurriedly advised, "Lord Mu, I think it's better not to go. I just heard bodyguard Shen talk about the situation inside. Since there are so many bats inside, I think even if the four of you go together, I'm afraid you won't be a match for those big bats. In that case, let's not go in and find another way." Mu Hongyi shook his head. "This place is so strange. Since we're here, how can we not take a look?" Fan Shouwu saw that Mu Hongyi insisted on going in and taking a look, so he thought for a while and asked, "Lord Mu, do you have any good ideas to deal with those bats?" Mu Hongyi shook his head. There is no good way. After we enter the passage, even if we are discovered by those bats, it doesn't matter. This passage is not wide. If several of us brothers stand side by side in the passage, I believe that those bats will not be able to rush in. At that time, we should be able to retreat while fighting. When Fan Shouwu heard this, he felt that although these large bats were ferocious, Mu Hongyi and the others' martial arts were definitely not to be trifled with. Even if they could not rush over, it should not be a problem for them to retreat. Thinking of this, Fan Shouwu cupped his fists towards Lord Mu Hongyi and said solemnly, "Then, please be more careful, Lord Mu. If you discover that something is wrong, do not continue to fight. Quickly withdraw." Mu Hongyi nodded and waved to his brothers. "Brothers, let's go in and have a look." Hearing this, Hudaki and the other two hurriedly walked to Mu Hongyi's side, waiting for his next order. At this moment, Shenfeisha, who was lying on the ground, suddenly struggled to stand up and shouted in a hoarse voice, "Big brother, wait for me, I will go in too." Mu Hongyi looked at the injuries on Shenfeisha's body and shook his head. "Fifth brother, you should stay outside." Shenfeisha shook his head. "I am more familiar with this passage than you. With me leading the way, you will at least be much safer." Mu Hongyi was a little hesitant. "But, your injuries," Shenfeisha smiled and waved his hand. "Big brother, it's okay, as long as you wrap it properly, there will be no problem." Mu Hongyi saw that Shenfeisha insisted on going, and that Shenfeisha was indeed the only one here who was familiar with the situation in the passage, so he could only nod helplessly. Seeing that their big brother nodded, Hudaki and the other two brothers hurriedly took out bandages and treated Shenfeisha's wounds. After a while, Shenfeisha's body was already wrapped in bandages. He was wrapped like a mummy. He waved his arm and said with a smile, "Okay, there is no problem. Big brother, let's go." Mu Hongyi nodded and turned around. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly heard a voice behind him. "Lord Mu, I will go with you." Hearing this, Mu Hongyi turned his head and saw Zhong Meng walking towards him. Zhong Meng quickly walked behind Mu Hongyi and said with a smile, "I will go too." Mu Hongyi was about to refuse when he suddenly remembered Zhong Meng's divine power. His heart skipped a beat, and he immediately nodded and asked, "Little brother, since you want to enter the passage, do you have a weapon?" Zhong Meng shook his head. Hearing this, Mu Hongyi looked around and waved at a guard in the distance. "Come here." The guard was Zhong Qiuming's guard. Seeing Mu Hongyi waving at him, he did not dare to be negligent. He hurriedly quickened his pace and came in front of Mu Hongyi. "Lord Mu, why did you call me here? What's the matter?" Mu Hongyi pointed at his sword and said, "Lend your sword to this little brother. When we come out, I will return it to you." Hearing this, the guard quickly took off his sword and handed it to Zhong Meng. Seeing this, Zhong Meng did not stand on ceremony. He reached out and took the sword from the guard and said with a smile, "Thank you." Seeing that Zhong Meng had a weapon, Mu Hongyi did not delay any longer. He immediately turned around and waved at his brothers behind him. Then, he strode towards the passage. Seeing that Mu Hongyi and his brothers had entered the passage, Zhong Meng smiled and walked towards the passage with the sword in his hand. At this moment, Fan Shouwu suddenly ran up from behind and said to Zhong Meng with a smile, "It's boring to wait outside. I'll go in with you." As soon as Fan Shouwu finished speaking, old Luo's voice sounded behind him. "Gongzi, it's too dangerous inside. You'd better not go. Come back quickly." Hearing this, Fan Shouwu turned his head and looked at old Luo. He said loudly, "I order you to wait outside." Just as old Luo was about to speak, Zhong Qiuming suddenly walked up from behind. He patted old Luo's shoulder and said with a smile, "You don't have to worry. Fan Gongzi and I will go in together. The fierce brothers will also take care of us. It should be fine. If we find those big bats." At this point, Zhong Qiuming lowered his voice and said to old Luo, "Even if we find those big bats, with Lord Mu and the others blocking in front, we will have no problem running back. Don't worry." Old Luo thought for a moment and felt that Zhong Qiuming's words made sense. With Mu Hongyi and the others blocking in front, there should be no problem for Gongzi to run back. Chapter 45. Under Shenfeisha's lead, Mu Hongyi and the others slowly walked into the passage. There was no trace of the big bats in the passage. They probably had no targets to attack, so they had all retreated. Now, they should have all returned to the large space. Shenfeisha had been here once and was naturally more familiar with it. Soon, he brought them to a place not far from the large space. Shenfeisha stopped, turned his head and lowered his voice to the lowest. "Big brother, those bats are just around the bend in front. We'll reach it after walking a short distance." Hearing this, Mu Hongyi nodded. He gently pulled out his sword and walked towards the bend in front. When the brothers saw that their big brother had gone up, they did not dare to be negligent. They all took out their own weapons and slowly walked towards the bend. Seeing that Mu Hongyi and the others had all walked over, Zhong Meng and the other two looked at each other and followed the footsteps of the people in front of them towards the bend. When Mu Hongyi approached the bend, a trace of doubt appeared on his face. He had already heard from Shenfeisha that there were countless big bats in this space. Logically speaking, there were a lot of bats in the space, so they should be able to hear a lot of sounds. However, there weren't a lot of sounds. Although there were sounds of wings hitting the rock walls, it was very few. What was the reason for this? Could it be that those big bats were all asleep? Mu Hongyi was a little puzzled, but in this situation, he did not dare to be too distracted. He could only hold the bright ray sword in his hand tightly and continue to walk towards the bend. When he came to the bend, Mu Hongyi took a deep breath. Then, he held his breath and slowly poked his head out of the bend. On the other side of the bend was indeed a very large space. However, it was not like what Shenfeisha had said, where the sky was filled with flying bats. No, the entire space was empty. There were not many bats flying in it. In the space, there were only a few bats that occasionally flew across the space. They kept flapping their wings and flew from one wall to the other. Seeing this scene, Mu Hongyi stepped back in confusion. He looked at Shenfeisha and asked in a low voice, "Old Five, is this really the place you saw?" Shenfeisha nodded. Seeing his big brother's face full of doubt, he was a little puzzled. He quickly walked to the corner and looked inside. Shenfeisha was shocked at what he saw. The many large bats that he had seen earlier had all disappeared. Shenfeisha was shocked and hurriedly looked around. This large space was actually a huge space made of rocks. Whether it was the walls or the ground, they were all made of rocks. At the bottom, there were 3 passageways that led to unknown places. After briefly looking at the situation in the large space, Shenfeisha returned to Mu Hongyi's side and asked with some confusion. "Big brother, when I came here just now, there were clearly a lot of big bats here. Why are they all gone now?" Mu Hongyi thought for a while and leaned out again to look into the space. At this time, when Mu Hongyi had just poked his head out, he heard a gust of wind in front of him. A black shadow flashed in front of him and he was shocked. He hurriedly waved the bright ray sword in his hand and stabbed the black shadow that flew over like lightning. After being stabbed by Mu Hongyi's sword, the black shadow immediately let out a scream. The large bat wings flapped twice and then fell to the ground. When the black shadow fell to the ground, Mu Hongyi saw clearly that it was a large bat that had flown over. As soon as this bat was stabbed to the ground by Mu Hongyi felt that there were a few more black shadows in front of him flying over. When Mu Hongyi saw this situation, he was not afraid. There were only a few bats, so it was not a problem. 3 bats flew out of the space and attacked Mu Hongyi like lightning. Mu Hongyi did not care. The bright ray sword in his hand shook slightly and turned into 3 sword flowers that covered the 3 black shadows that flew over. After a while, after a few screams, the 3 large bats that flew over were stabbed by Mu Hongyi one by one and fell to the ground. Although Mu Hongyi had stabbed these bats, there were not many bats left in the entire space. However, that was only relative to the situation where the entire space was filled with bats. Although there were fewer bats, there were still a lot of them. After Mu Hongyi stabbed a few large bats, he immediately attracted the attention of the rest of the large bats. The originally quiet space gradually became chaotic. Countless bats flapped their wings and flew up from the walls. Their wings flapped on the rock walls and made a patter sound. Patter, patter, patter. After a while, this kind of sound became more and more. The number of large bats that began to fly in the space also increased. Seeing a large number of large bats gather in the large space again, Mu Hongi was also shocked. No matter how high his martial arts were, when he saw so many large bats, he felt a sense of helplessness in his heart. The sound that came from the large space also alarmed everyone. Hudaki and the others walked to the corner and looked into the large space. When they saw the situation in the large space clearly, everyone was shocked. When Mu Hongi saw that his brothers had all come over, he immediately shouted, "Hurry up and get into a defensive formation to block the attack of these large bats." When Hudaki and the others heard this, they finally reacted. They did not dare to delay any longer. They hurriedly took out their weapons and stood beside Mu Hongi. This passage was not wide. Mu Hongi and his brothers wanted to all stand in a row. In fact, this would not increase their fighting power because it would be too crowded. When they used their martial arts, they would also have to worry about hurting their own people. Therefore, only Mu Hongi, Lan Zhiyong and Zhong Yundao were at the front. Hudaki was a long-range attacker and naturally was not used to close combat. Therefore, he supported everyone from the back. Shenfeisha was injured and could only be a substitute. He hid at the back. If there was any abnormal situation in front, he would go up in time to deal with it. Just as Mu Hongi and the others got into a defensive formation, the large bats rushed over. Mu Hongi and the other two just happened to be blocking the entrance of the passage. Facing the sky full of large bats, the three of them were also anxious. These large bats not only had sharp teeth and claws, but their flying speed was also incomparably fast. When they glided through the air, they were almost like red lightning that flashed across everyone's eyes. Mu Hongi used a bright ray sword, while Lan Zhiyong and Zhong Yundao both used a saber. The three of them each held a weapon and nervously looked at the large bats flying in front of them, guarding against the sudden attack of these large bats. Chapter 46. A moment later, the large bats that were flying in the sky began to attack the invaders. The black swarm of bats flapped their wings, emitting flapping sounds that reverberated in this large space. Seeing so many large bats, even the usually calm Mu Hongi turned pale with fright. He hurriedly instructed in a low voice, "Brothers, be careful. There are too many of these bats. Don't let them attack you." As soon as Mu Hongi finished speaking, the large bats that filled the sky had already gathered together and rushed towards the three people at the entrance of the passageway. Seeing the black mass of bats rushing over, Mu Hongi's face changed. He hurriedly shouted, "Brothers, use your unique skills to deal with these bats." As he spoke, the bright ray sword in Mu Hongi's hand had already transformed into a dazzling brilliance that shot towards the large bat that was charging towards them. Flowing light, water cut, broken stone. Three beams of white light emitted a dazzling brilliance. At this moment, it almost illuminated the dark space. The three of them unleashed their ultimate skills with a ferocious force, attacking the giant bat that was charging towards them. Poof, poof, poof. The three lightning-fast streaks of light hit a large number of bats, producing a series of sounds. Then, the bats that collided with the three streaks of light fell from the sky like rain. The unique skills of the three of them were really extraordinary. After the three of them launched a round of attacks at the same time, more than half of the originally densely packed bats in the sky were actually cleared out. Although there were still some bats flying in the air, they were no longer a concern. Zhong Meng, who was watching from behind, was also very impressed. He originally thought that Mu Hongi was very strong, but he didn't expect him to be strong to this extent. Although the three of them had joined forces to attack, more than half of the bats that were shot down from the sky were shot down by Mu Hongi's skill, flowing light. In this attack, Lan Zhiyong and Zhong Yundao added together didn't kill as many bats as Mu Hongi. From this, one could imagine how powerful Mu Hongi's battle power was. Zhong Meng felt that if Hudaki and the others fought Mu Hongi alone, they wouldn't be able to take more than 10 moves from Mu Hongi. In the sky, there were not many large bats left. Mu Hongi and the other two did not need to use their ultimate skills anymore. After all, the greater the power of their ultimate skills, the more internal energy it would consume. If they could handle it, no one would continuously use their ultimate skills. Even so, even though Mu Hongi and the others did not use their ultimate moves, the weapons in their hands still danced vigorously. Almost every attack would take down a large bat. There weren't many bats left to begin with. Under the combined attacks of the three of them, the large bats that had rushed over were quickly wiped out. Seeing that there were no more bats attacking, Mu Hongi put away the sword in his hand and checked the situation in the space. Master Gerald looked at the underground poison frog's poison sac that his subordinate handed over. He was very satisfied. If he could collect a lot of these things, it would be quite a fortune. Looking at the 3 tunnels in front of him, Gerard began to hesitate. He had never encountered such a situation before, but he had heard of it from others. In some labyrinths, such a situation would occur. At the end of the tunnel, there would be a fork, and these forked tunnels would naturally lead to different places. Many people had said that some of these tunnels would lead to places full of treasures, while others would lead to traps at the end of the tunnel. The most terrifying one was the last type of tunnel. It would lead to a dead end. As long as one entered this tunnel, there was almost no possibility of survival. Thinking of the news he had heard, Gerard felt a chill in his heart. Looking at the 3 tunnels in front of him, he couldn't make up his mind which tunnel to go to. Gerard wanted to retreat, but he couldn't bear to part with the treasures that might appear. If he was lucky and walked directly to a secret room full of treasures, then as long as he brought a large number of treasures back, his position in the family would be as stable as a rock. Of course, if he entered a dead end, then there was no need to think about anything. Gerard saw the 3 tunnels, and so did Carter. He looked at the tunnels carefully and turned his head. However, when he saw Gerard staring at the 3 tunnels in a daze, he couldn't help but turn his head and ask, "Young Master Gerard, should we go on or retreat?" Gerard heard this and was even more hesitant. He wanted to get the treasures, but he didn't want to take the risk. However, there were 3 tunnels here. Who knew which tunnel would lead to the treasures? Retreating was very safe, but it would also mean that he had missed a good opportunity. Gerard had already missed a good opportunity. He had watched Carter's strength increase for nothing. This time, Gerard really didn't want to give up. If it was the same as the previous time, he would have missed another good opportunity. Because of the previous incident, Gerard had secretly slapped himself a few times. This time, he decided to take the risk. Thinking of this, Gerard waved at Carter. "Carter, come here." Carter heard this and hurried over. "Master Gerald, what's the matter?" Gerard pointed to the 3 tunnels in front and asked, "Which tunnel do you think we should take?" Gerard asked for Carter's opinion because he felt that Carter's luck was very good. Otherwise, he wouldn't have such a good opportunity to increase his strength. Therefore, Gerard wanted to borrow Carter's good luck to see if it could bring him good luck. Carter heard this and shook his head. "I don't know either. You can give the order. Whichever tunnel you want to go to, we will go there." Gerard heard this and was angry. "If I knew which tunnel to go to, why would I ask you?" "Carter, my good brother, think about it carefully. Which tunnel do you think we should go to? I want to hear your opinion." When Carter heard this, he pointed to the tunnel in the middle and said, "If I were to choose, I would choose the tunnel in the middle." Gerard asked, "Why? Why would you choose the tunnel in the middle?" Carter shook his head and smiled honestly. "I don't know either. I just like the tunnel in the middle." Carter's reason made Gerard a little speechless. He felt that Carter's suggestion was a little unreliable. He didn't give up and asked again, "Don't you have other reasons for choosing the tunnel in the middle?" Carter shook his head again. "No matter what I choose, I like to choose the tunnel in the middle." Chapter 47. Although Carter's suggestion did not sound very reliable, Gerard still decided to listen to him. As for the reason, it was because Carter was lucky. Since he wanted to make use of his good luck, he would listen to his suggestion. Thinking of this, Gerard did not hesitate anymore. He raised his hand and waved forcefully. "Everyone, get ready. We will advance from the middle passage." After hearing Gerard's words, the guards responded and hurriedly went to prepare their own things. After a while, Gerard ordered 2 guards to explore the way in front, and the rest of the people to walk behind. Carter was the most powerful person here, but Gerard asked him to stay by his side. After all, his own safety was the most important. Carter was highly skilled in martial arts. With him by his side to protect him, his safety should not be a problem. The group of people started to walk towards the middle passage. The two guards at the front held their weapons tightly in their hands and carefully explored the path in front. At the same time, they were constantly looking at the path behind them. They were constantly thinking about where they should escape to if they met an enemy. The two of them did not have Carter's martial arts skills. If they met with danger, it would be quite dangerous. After entering the middle passage, they did not walk far before they realized a big problem. The passage was divided into 7 or 8 paths in front of them. Not only that, there were many passages on both sides of the passage. Seeing this situation, Gerard turned to look at Carter again and asked, "Carter, what should we do next?" When Carter heard this, although he did not understand why Gerard kept asking him, he was not so playful and did not think about these things. When he heard Gerard's question, he replied casually, "If it were up to me, I would choose the widest path." Gerard asked, "Why would you choose the widest path?" Carter replied, "Because it's wide." "What reason do you need?" "It's so comfortable to walk on the wide road." When Gerard heard this, he was speechless. This guy actually used this reason. He was really too powerful. However, Gerard only thought for a moment before he immediately passed down this order. Since he wanted to make use of Carter's good luck, he could only listen to him. There was no other choice. Gerard's order made the two guards in front of him very happy. After all, they were also willing to walk on the spacious road. This was because if they were walking on a spacious road, at least the two guards in front of them could walk side by side. If they were walking on a narrow path, then the problem would arise. Who would be in front of them? Most importantly, no one was willing to explore the path at the front. No one was a fool. Walking at the front was definitely the most dangerous. They were all Gerard's employees. It was fine if they were just trying to make a living, but if they were risking their lives, then they could forget about it. After Gerard's order was conveyed, the group began to move forward along the relatively spacious passage. At this moment, the two guards who were scouting ahead suddenly felt a black shadow flash across the small passageway on the side. Then, the black shadow let out a cry. Cuckoo. Following this cry, the two guards in front of them began to cry out in pain. One of the guards had already fallen to the ground and was rolling around non-stop. The other guard, on the other hand, was slapping his arms non-stop. The two screams that came out of their mouths were incomparably tragic. The people walking behind them were shocked. They all raised their weapons and looked ahead cautiously. At this moment, the guard who had been slapping his arms non-stop suddenly moved to a small passageway on the side of him. And from this small passageway, came another cry. Cuckoo. The moment the cry ended, the guard who had been standing and screaming immediately fell to the ground as well. He began to roll non-stop on the ground, letting out even more heart-chilling cries. Seeing the pitiful state of the two guards, Gerard was scared out of his wits. He couldn't help but take a few steps back and hide behind Carter. He asked in a trembling voice, "What's going on in front?" Hearing Gerard's question, the guards, who had been looking ahead nervously, hurriedly answered, "I don't know. It seems like they've been attacked." Gerard heard this and scolded angrily, "Do you think I don't know that they've been attacked? Quick, let me see what's attacking them." When the guards heard this, they raised their weapons and slowly walked forward fearfully. Just as the guards took 2 steps forward, suddenly, a long object flew out from the passageway and hit one of the guards. This sudden change scared the guard so much that he screamed and took 2 steps back. But this wasn't the end. After the object hit the guard, it began to shrink back. And the guard was actually stuck by the object. It was impossible for him to get rid of it. He could only follow the object into the passageway. Looking at this situation, Carter understood that there must be an underground poison frog hidden in this small passageway. The two guards who had fallen to the ground and cried out in pain must have been attacked by the underground poison frog's venom. That's why they cried out so miserably. As for the guard who was being pulled, he must have been stuck by its tongue. Thinking of this, Carter hurriedly took out his big axe and shouted at the same time, "Hurry up and cut off its tongue," but it was too late. The guard who was scared out of his wits had already been dragged into the dark passageway when Carter shouted. After the guard was dragged into the passageway, his screams disappeared in the blink of an eye. Facing the danger in the dark, Carter didn't dare to be careless. He quickly approached the passageway and began to carefully look forward. At this time, the two guards who were rolling on the ground and screaming were no longer screaming. It seemed that they had been killed. Carter carefully approached the passageway and then walked into the small passageway. Just as he approached the small passageway, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. He knew that something was wrong. Without thinking much, he stomped hard on the ground and dodged in the direction he came from. Just as he dodged the attack, a ball of mucus hit the spot where he was originally standing. Since Carter dodged the attack, the mucus hit the opposite rock. This ball of mucus hit the rock, and in the next moment, the hard rock began to make a sizzling sound. In just a moment, this ball of mucus had corroded a large groove in the rock. Seeing the power of this ball of mucus, Carter was scared out of his wits. Fortunately, he reacted quickly just now. Otherwise, he would have ended up like the two guards. Chapter 48. When everyone saw the effect of the mucus hitting the rock, their faces changed and they all took a step back in fright. Carter didn't dare to be careless. In the face of such terrifying venom, he didn't dare to face it head-on. If the underground poison frog hiding in the darkness attacked him again, then he might not be so lucky. Thinking of this, he also took 2 steps back and hid in a small passage where the underground poison frogs couldn't attack. Only then did he stop. At this time, he realized that his clothes were already soaked in sweat. Carter wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and didn't bother to look for the underground poison frog in the small passage. He turned to Gerard and said softly, "Master Gerard, I think we should retreat. It's too dangerous here. The venom of those underground poison frogs is simply too powerful." At this moment, Gerard was so scared that his face turned sallow. When he thought of how many underground poison frogs were hiding in this dark passage, he felt a chill in his heart. At this moment, Gerard had long forgotten that the underground poison frog's venom sac was very valuable. At this moment, the value of the venom sac was no longer important. What was important was that their lives were more important. After hearing Carter's words, Gerard immediately shouted in a hoarse voice, "All of you listen carefully. Gather around me and we'll retreat." When the guards heard this, they immediately felt as if they had been pardoned and hurriedly gathered around Gerard. At the same time, they looked at the situation in front of them vigilantly. Seeing that all the guards had surrounded him, Gerard was slightly relieved. He felt that even if the underground poison frog rushed over and spat venom at him, these guards in front of him would definitely not be able to attack him. Thinking of this, Gerard regained some of his courage and shouted loudly, "Let's slowly retreat to the outside now." Although they were retreating, no one dared to run away. If that was the case, if the underground poison frog attacked them, they wouldn't have the chance to resist even if they wanted to. Everyone was facing the passageway and slowly retreating outwards. Only a few people who were walking at the back were looking outside the passageway and leading the way. The group retreated relatively smoothly. Soon, they retreated to the 3-way junction and returned to the large space they had entered at the beginning. Just as Gerard heaved a sigh of relief, his gaze suddenly froze. His heart began to beat wildly, and cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Right in front of the passageway they came in, there were 2 huge underground poisonous frogs guarding the left and right sides of the passageway. Seeing this situation, Gerard was so regretful that his intestines turned green. He constantly scolded himself in his heart. Why was he so greedy? It seemed that it would be very difficult for him to withdraw. When Gerard set off from home, he brought a total of 26 guards with him. Including himself and Carter, the group had a total of 28 people. In terms of numbers, Gerard's team was the largest among the 3 teams that had come here to investigate. However, his losses were also the heaviest. Of course, this was also because his team was the weakest among the 3 teams. The team sent by the Custer family was not meant to fight a tough battle. They were only sent as a small scouting team to investigate the whereabouts of the Nightmare Eagle. In the end, Gerard's luck was very bad. First, they encountered the Great Earth Bear and lost many people, reducing the number of people in his team to 18. In order to explore this cave, they lost 3 guards at the beginning. In the following exploration, they lost another 4 guards. Until now, Gerard's team was only left with 11 people. Including himself and Carter, there were only 13 people left. Looking at the 2 underground poisonous frogs on the left and right sides of the passageway, everyone's faces turned pale again. They all looked at their only hope, Carter. When they had just entered the passageway, Carter had already killed one of the underground poisonous frogs. Now, everyone only hoped that Carter could show his prowess again and kill these 2 underground poisonous frogs. When Carter saw everyone looking at him, he smiled bitterly and shook his head. When he first fought with the underground poisonous frogs, he really relied on his courage. To be honest, if he had known that the underground poisonous frogs could spit venom, he wouldn't dare to guarantee that he would still be so brave. At this moment, Gerard was also looking at Carter with anticipation. He really hoped that Carter could stand up bravely and fight with the 2 underground poisonous frogs. When Carter saw this, he could only scratch his head helplessly. Although his strength had increased now, it was useless in front of these 2 underground poisonous frogs. No matter how high one's martial arts were, as long as one was hit by the underground poisonous frog's venom, it would be over. When he thought of this, Carter could only look away and pretend that he didn't see everyone's gazes. Gerard saw that Carter was staring at the rock wall in a daze. It was as if there was something good carved on the rock wall. He was studying it so carefully and so attentively. When Gerard saw this, he could only cough heavily, hoping that Carter would notice him. However, he was disappointed. At this moment, Carter seemed to be deaf. After hearing his cough, there was no reaction at all. Gerard was helpless. He could only walk forward and pat Carter's shoulder with a smile. "Carter, my good brother. Among us, only you have fought with the underground poisonous frogs and won." When Gerard said this, he deliberately stopped and didn't continue speaking. He wanted to see Carter's reaction. After hearing Gerard's words, Carter was too embarrassed to continue looking at the wall. He could only turn his head and laugh dryly. "Lucky, really lucky. If I really fought with these underground poisonous frogs, I definitely wouldn't be their match." When Gerard heard this, the smile on his face froze. He finally understood that this kid didn't want to fight with the 2 underground poisonous frog. However, Gerard didn't have a choice. On one hand, he couldn't beat Carter. On the other hand, Carter wasn't his subordinate after all. He couldn't order him around like the other subordinates. Gerard smiled awkwardly and continued, "If we don't get rid of the 2 underground poisonous frogs at the entrance of the tunnel, we won't be able to escape. Carter, my good brother, I know that your martial arts are high. These 2 underground poisonous frogs are all depending on you." Seeing that Gerard was so direct, Carter couldn't play dumb anymore and could only say, "Master Gerald, you also know that the underground poisonous frogs are too powerful. Other aspects are fine, but the key is their venom attack. None of us can withstand it. Even if I go up, as long as I'm hit by their venom, I'll be done for." Chapter 49. Gerard was speechless when he heard that. He had to admit that Carter was right. No one could withstand the subterranean poison frog's venom attack. Even the rocks on the walls were corroded to form a huge pit. One could only imagine how powerful the subterranean poison frog's venom attack was. Although the venom attack of the underground poison frogs was very powerful, they had to break through the blockade of the 2 underground poison frogs if they wanted to escape. Gerard looked at the 2 underground poison frogs in front of him and felt waves of regret. Not only did he regret entering this passage, but he also regretted making this trip. He wasn't the leader of the scouting team back then. He was the one who begged his father to let him come. Thinking of this, Gerard's heart skipped a beat. Why did he come? Wasn't it for Vilanica? Who was Vilanica? She was a priest's apprentice. During the battle with the underground poison frogs, Gerard remembered very clearly that Vilanica had launched a lightning attack to participate in the battle. Thinking of this, Gerard had another idea. He hurriedly walked in front of Vilanica and said with a smile, "Vilanica, use your lightning attack on the 2 underground poison frogs in a while. Can you do it?" Vilanica looked at the 2 underground poison frogs in front of her and calculated the distance in her heart. She felt that there was no problem and nodded. Gerard was overjoyed when he saw this. Although Vilanica's lightning attack wasn't very powerful, it had a numbing effect. Although Vilanica had agreed to help, Gerard was still a little worried. He thought for a while and decided to let Velanica attack first. He wanted to see the effect of the lightning attack on the underground poison frogs. Velanica, attack the underground poison frogs once first. Let's see the effect. Hearing this, Velanica silently nodded her head. She raised her black fur staff and started to silently chant an incantation. A moment later, Velanica raised her black fur staff and pointed it at the underground poison frog in front of her. A white light shot out from the staff and hit the underground poison frog like lightning. Coo! After the underground poison frog was struck by the lightning, it let out a miserable cry and stood there motionless. However, the subterranean poison frog was only numbed for a short period of time. In the blink of an eye, it returned to normal. When the underground poison frog saw that someone was attacking it, it was furious. It opened its mouth and its tongue flew out like lightning. Unfortunately, the distance between them was too far and its attack was useless. As for the other underground poison frog, it leaped forward forcefully and landed in front of everyone. It did not hold back and directly spat out a mouthful of mucus onto the guard at the front. After the guard was hit by the venom, he screamed and fell to the ground in pain. He kept rolling around on the ground while screaming. However, the underground poison frog did not stop attacking. It opened its mouth and suddenly shot out its tongue, hitting another guard. Then, it pulled back forcefully and that guard fell into its bloody mouth. This series of changes happened in a flash. When Carter took out his big axe and rushed forward to save the guard, that guard had already fallen into the frog's mouth. When Carter saw this, he immediately roared in anger. He waved his big axe with both hands and chopped at the underground poison frog. At this moment, the underground poison frog had just retrieved that guard into its mouth. When it saw someone attacking it, it immediately turned its head to aim at Carter and launched a venom attack. Unfortunately, with that guard in its mouth, all the venom sprayed on him. When Carter saw that the underground poison frog's venom did not spurt out, he was overjoyed. He did not dare to be negligent and directly swung his big axe at the underground poison frog's head. Carter used a lot of strength. After this swing, almost the entire axe landed on the underground poison frog's body. Croak croak. After this underground poison frog was hit, it immediately screamed in pain and hurriedly turned around, wanting to escape. However, after Carter's attack succeeded, how could he let it go? He swung his big axe again and hit the underground poison frog. This time, the underground poison frog could not take it anymore. After a few screams, it fell to the ground and did not move anymore. At this moment, another underground poison frog jumped over. However, it only jumped a small step. When it was still a distance away from everyone, its tongue attack was launched again. This underground poison frog might not be hungry. It changed its strategy and no longer pulled the enemy back with its tongue. Instead, it wrapped its tongue around the guard's neck. In just a moment, that guard was dead. The underground poison frog retracted its tongue and shot it out again, attacking another guard with lightning speed. At this moment, Velanica's lightning attack was launched again. The lightning passed over everyone's heads and landed on the underground poison frog in front of everyone. Just as the guard whose neck was wrapped by the tongue was screaming in despair, he felt the force on his tongue weaken. In the next moment, a figure flashed in front of him. Carter had already rushed up and chopped off the underground poison frog's tongue with his axe. After losing the pull, the guard grabbed the thing on his neck and fell to the ground. Although it was painful from the fall, he was overjoyed to know that he had survived. At this moment, the effect of the lightning attack was over. The underground poison frog's numbness disappeared. It then screamed and jumped to the side of the tunnel, escaping into the dark tunnel. This was a short encounter. Although it was very short, it was quite intense. Everything happened in the time it took for a spark to fly off a piece of flint, and the battle was over. Carter had used up almost all of his strength in the series of actions just now. Seeing that the underground poison frog had escaped, he couldn't care less. He sat on the ground and panted heavily, trying to recover the strength that he had used up quickly. Seeing that one of the two underground poison frogs at the entrance of the tunnel had been eliminated and the other had been chased away, Gerard was overjoyed. He really didn't expect that the situation of certain death would be resolved just like that. Thinking that he could escape, he couldn't hold it in anymore and laughed heartily. Although Gerard was overjoyed, the rest of the guards were sadly checking on the guards who had been attacked. The guard who had been attacked by the venom was already dying. The guard who had been swallowed by the underground poison frog was also dead after being dragged out by everyone. Out of the 2 guards who had been curled up by the underground poison frog's tongue, only one of them was lucky enough to survive. Out of the 11 guards, there were only 8 guards left. It could be said that after entering the tunnel, Gerard's team had suffered heavy losses. Chapter 50. The group rested for a while before walking out of the tunnel. After exiting the tunnel, Gerard cheered loudly as he felt the sunlight outside. Although his actions caused a large amount of dust to fly up from the ground, Gerard felt that the dust was not as annoying as before. At this moment, the battle between the fierce-wind mercenary group and the large-toothed rats was intense. The ones at the forefront were the vice-captain of the wind-splitting mercenary group, Lowell, and Field. Faced with the attacks of numerous large-toothed rats, Lowell desperately waved the mace in his hand to block the incoming large-toothed rats. However, the mace in his hand was too long. Sometimes, when he waved it, it would hit the rock wall next to him, causing a temporary stalemate. The large-toothed rats would take advantage of this short period of time to break through Lowell's defense and rush directly to him. Raoul was very passive and helpless. Although he had a lot of strength, as long as he couldn't swing his mace, everything he did was in vain. On the other hand, Field, who was beside Lowell, seemed to be much more relaxed. His weapons were a pair of boxing gloves with a pair of sharp blades on them. At this moment, this pair of sharp blades had great lethality. Not only were they flexible, but their sharpness was definitely not inferior to weapons such as swords. Seeing a few more large-toothed rats rushing in front of him, Lowell shouted loudly and waved the mace in his hand. From bottom to top, he swept the large-toothed rats horizontally and sent them flying. However, there were too many large-toothed rats. As soon as Lowell sent these large-toothed rats flying, he saw a few more large-toothed rats running along the wall and rushing in his direction. At this moment, Lowell's mace was already above his head. When he saw the large-toothed rats rushing over from the wall, he immediately shouted loudly, "Good timing." As soon as Lowell's voice fell, the mace in his hand immediately changed direction and whizzed toward the large-toothed rats on the wall. Bang! As soon as he swung the mace in his hand, Lowell felt his hand sink, and a huge recoil numbed his hand. He knew that this attack had accidentally hit the ceiling of the passage again. Seeing that the situation was not good, Lowell hurriedly retracted his mace and wanted to smash it again, but it was too late. The rat was very fast, and when Lowell was stunned, it had already passed through his defense circle. While squeaking, it pounced on Lowell. Seeing these little guys rushing to his side, Lowell knew that he was in trouble. Without hesitation, he threw away the mace in his hand and used his bare hands to hit the rats that were pouncing on him. A total of 3 rats pounced on Raoul. Although Raoul's usual weapon was a mace, it didn't mean that his fists were weak. Lowell threw a punch and hit the body of a large-toothed rat. The huge force directly sent the rat flying. At the same time, another large-toothed rat beside him was sent flying. At this time, the remaining large-toothed rat had already grabbed Lowell's clothes and started to eat. Just as Lowell sent the large-toothed rat flying with a punch, he felt a piercing pain coming from his body. It was so painful that he couldn't help but scream. At the same time, he waved his fist again and smashed it toward the remaining large-toothed rat. The large-toothed rat's bite was different from other animals. It would not bite the other party tightly. Instead, it would use its fastest speed to gnaw at the other party. This was very scary. Although this large-toothed rat didn't rush over for long, it made Lowell lose a lot of things. After Lowell sent the large-toothed rat flying, he looked up and was suddenly frightened. In front of him, a few large-toothed rats rushed over from the wall. Not only that, but there were also a few large-toothed rats on the ground not far away. Lowell didn't dare to be negligent. He didn't even bother to pick up the mace. He directly waved his fist and hit the large-toothed rats on the wall. Although Lowell's fist attack was fast, he was still familiar with the mace after all. Under his violent bombardment, 2 large-toothed rats broke through the defense of his fist and rushed towards him. At this time, Lowell didn't dare to be negligent. He hurriedly stopped and grabbed the 2 large-toothed rats that rushed over. Although he caught the 2 large-toothed rats, they still caused him a lot of damage. Lowell only felt bursts of piercing pain coming from his body. He was so angry that he grabbed the 2 large-toothed rats and threw them at the other large-toothed rats that rushed over from the ground. Under the power of Lowell's anger, the 2 large-toothed rats that he threw out directly smashed the other 2 large-toothed rats that rushed over to him. This weakened the attack of the large-toothed rats a little. However, it was useless. The large-toothed rats seemed to be endless. They rushed out from the darkness. It seemed that no matter how many large-toothed rats the 2 people in front of him killed, there would be no reduction. Seeing that there were more and more large-toothed rats rushing over, Field suddenly shouted to Lowell. "Lowell, step back a little. I'm going to use my ultimate skill." When Lowell heard this, he didn't dare to be negligent. He didn't care about attacking the large-toothed rats in front of him anymore. He immediately took a few steps back. It was also at this time that Field suddenly roared. "Peerless!" As soon as Field's voice fell, his hands flipped left and right in front of him. His gloves were full of sharp blades. In the dark passage, white lights were drawn one after another. Soon, streaks of white light merged together and surrounded Ferday's body. In the passage, as Field's skill was activated, the sound of his gloves breaking through the air was suddenly heard. It was like the sharp laughter of the Grim Reaper in the dark night. After Field's peerless skill was activated, the white lights that were drawn by his hands almost covered the entire passage. All the large-toothed rats that rushed over were torn into pieces by this white light. A large number of large-toothed rats, like moths to a flame, rushed into the circle of Field's skill. However, without exception, all of them were cut into pieces and fell to the 4 corners. If Field's ultimate skill was activated in an open area, the power would only be considered average. After all, the attack area of this skill was small, which was a huge weakness. However, at this moment, it had become his greatest advantage. Ferday's unparalleled skill had been activated. At this moment, he was like the king of this tunnel. Any megalodon rat that pounced on him would be turned into ashes by his skill. Even Lowell, who was standing not far behind Field, was shocked when he saw this skill at this moment. In the past, Lowell had often mocked Field's skill, saying that this skill was the most useless. However, Lowell didn't think so now. Chapter 51. This peerless skill of Ferday's had an advantage. It could be used continuously until his combat energy was depleted. Only then would the skill disappear. Of course, he could also stop the skill midway. Other people's skills required a certain amount of internal energy to be accumulated and then used. Once the accumulated internal energy was exhausted, the skill would disappear. If one wanted to use the skill again, they would need to accumulate internal energy again before they could use it again. At this moment, after Field had used his peerless skill, the entire passage was immediately filled with a situation where one man could hold back 10,000 enemies. Countless large-toothed rats were cut into pieces by the peerless skill. At this moment, Field was like a god of death. His body emitted a cold white light as he rushed towards the large-toothed rats. Although Field's peerless skill was powerful, these large-toothed rats seemed to be endless. They rushed out from the darkness. No matter how many large-toothed rats Field killed, it seemed to be useless. The peerless skill was incomparably powerful, but it also consumed a lot of combat power. Soon, Field's speed slowed down. Gradually, the white light around him disappeared. In the next moment, Field's tall body fell to the ground. Raoul, who was standing on the side, already knew what would happen after Field used his peerless skill. After seeing Field fall down, he didn't dare to be negligent. He hurriedly rushed forward, grabbed him, and dragged him back. This was also because Field's peerless skill was so powerful that it destroyed a few meters in front of him. That was why Raoul had the chance to drag him back. After Raoul dragged Field back, Green and the Gale mercenary group's thief, Nico, came up from behind. Nico was a thief. He was used to using a dagger. Of course, as an experienced thief, he naturally wouldn't only be equipped with one dagger. He would definitely have another dagger as a backup. At this moment, Nico was holding a dagger in each hand, blocking the large-toothed rats rushing from the right. Green, on the other hand, was waving his two-handed sword to block the large-toothed rats rushing from the left. In the Gale mercenary group, other than Nico who used a dagger and Field who used boxing gloves, the rest of the people used long weapons. Therefore, this time, Nico was the only one who used a short weapon. Nico's pair of daggers flew up and down like two rays of white light dancing in front of him to deal with the charging megalodon rats. The megalodon rats that had rushed in front of Nico were pierced by the two white lights and fell to the ground. On the other hand, Green's situation was not good. The weapon he was using was a two-handed greatsword, which was naturally not short. The consequences of waving it in the passage were similar to Lowell's. It was extremely difficult to fight, and he was surrounded by dangers. The mercenaries at the back were anxious, but there was nothing they could do. The passageway was only so wide. It was still acceptable for two people to fight side by side. If there were more people, it would be easy to accidentally injure one another. The fierce wind mercenary group's archers paused. They drew their bows several times, trying to reduce the pressure on the two people in front of them. However, not a single arrow was released. The passage was too narrow. Even if his archery skills were very good, he didn't dare to act rashly. He was afraid that he would accidentally hurt the two people fighting in front of him. Although Green and Raoul both used long weapons, there was one difference between them. Green used a sword while Raoul used a mace. The sword in Green's hand had the effect of cutting, while Raoul's mace could only smash. Therefore, Grim still had a slight advantage in the battle with these megalodon rats. Although the situation was a little better than Raoul's, Green was still very depressed. Seeing that there were several megalodon rats rushing in front of him, Green didn't dare to be negligent. He hurriedly stabbed the two-handed greatsword in his hand. At the same time, he waved it up and down, killing several megalodon rats that rushed in front of him. At the same time, several megalodon rats that rushed toward Nico were stabbed one by one and sent flying to the side. It was also at this time that a megalodon rat that hadn't been stabbed to death by Nico, after being sent flying, unexpectedly rushed toward Green. At first, the two people didn't notice this. When Green noticed it, it was already too late. The megalodon rat had already jumped onto his leg. As soon as the megalodon rat jumped onto Green's leg, it immediately activated its eating function. Suddenly, Green felt a series of pain coming from his leg. It was so painful that he couldn't help but shout. He waved his hand hard and sent the megalodon rat flying. The megalodon rat that had just eaten was suddenly smashed into the wall. It then slid down the wall and fell to the ground, never to move again. Although the megalodon rat was killed, the damage it had caused to Green was still there. The megalodon rat ate very quickly. In just a moment, it had caused a very big wound to Green. This huge pain made Green a little absent-minded. It was also during this moment that he was absent-minded that 5 megalodon rats rushed toward him from the ground and the wall. Green wanted to wave his great sword to block, but it was already too late. Seeing that the situation was urgent, he didn't have time to think. He hurriedly withdrew one of his hands and suddenly shouted, "Lightning attack!" As soon as his voice fell, a dazzling white light appeared in the palm of his hand, flickering in the dark passage. As soon as the white light appeared, it immediately hit the body of a megalodon rat. After this megalodon rat was hit by the lightning, it immediately screamed and fell to the ground. Launching this lightning attack was only an act of desperation on Green's part. Green was a paladin. He could launch simple magic, which was those relatively low-level magic. Lightning attacks like this could only hit one target. The damage was not great, and it could only temporarily numb the target. Grim's lightning attack was merely a subconscious reaction. Although the lightning attack struck down a megalodon rat that rushed over, Green knew that it was useless. This was because there were as many as 5 megalodon rats rushing toward him. Even if he killed one megalodon rat, there were still 4 megalodon rats rushing toward him. In desperation, Green could only do the same thing as Lowell. He threw away the greatsword in his hand and wanted to use his fists to deal with these megalodon rats. But just as Green threw away the greatsword in his hand, he suddenly realized that these megalodon rats that rushed toward him had run away. That's right. Not only did the 4 megalodon rats that rushed toward him run away, but even the megalodon rats that rushed toward him from afar also ran back while squeaking. Seeing this change, Green was a little confused. He didn't understand what had happened. Just as he was in a daze, Vice Commander Scott suddenly rushed up and shouted excitedly. Chapter 52. Scott, the vice captain of the Gale Mercenary Corps, was standing far away. He could see clearly and saw the problem at a glance. Captain, it turns out that these rats are afraid of light. Afraid of light? Glenn repeated this sentence and immediately reacted. These megalodon rats ran away because they saw the white light on the lightning attack. Glenn looked at the empty passage in front of him. He felt that everything that had happened was like a dream. The large-toothed rats that had been rushing over like a tidal wave actually ran away just because he had launched a lightning attack. Wasn't this a bit too childish? Scott looked at the dark passage in front of him and said, "It seems that these rats have lived in the dark for a long time. It is possible that they were scared when they saw the white light." Glenn nodded. Other than Scott's explanation, there was nothing else that could explain why these sawtooth rats ran away. However, no matter what the reason was, it was a good thing that the rats ran away. Seeing that there was no danger in the passage, the mercenaries surrounded Glenn and Raoul and treated their wounds. After the wounds were treated, Glenn saw that everyone was very nervous. He ordered them to rest. Looking at the fragments of the rats on the ground, Glenn hesitated. Should he go in or not? Although these megalodon rats had run away, Grim was certain that these little creatures must have hidden themselves somewhere. Who knew when they would come rushing back like a tidal wave? Thinking of the battle just now, if he had not subconsciously launched the lightning attack at that time, it would have been hard to say what would have happened. Although he wanted to go in and see what was inside, he was not alone. There were so many of his brothers here. What if they could not go back after entering the passage? What should he do? Glenn hesitated again. Raoul helped Field up and let him lean against the wall. At the same time, he gave him a thumbs up and praised him. "I didn't expect that stupid skill of yours to be so powerful." Field heard this and was furious. He shouted weakly, "Raoul, whose skill are you calling a broken skill? I'm saying that yours is a broken skill. Don't forget, when you were being bitten by those megalodon rats, it was my lousy skill that saved you. You bastard, if I knew you were this kind of person, I wouldn't have saved you no matter what." When Lowell heard this, he knew that he had misspoken and hurriedly said with a smile, "Field, you know that's not what I meant. I just got used to calling you that. That's how I used to call you. It's not easy to change it. But don't worry, I won't care about that skill of yours anymore. Don't call it a lousy skill anymore." Field was so angry that his eyebrows jumped when he heard Lowell call it a lousy skill. But after thinking about it, he waved his hand weakly and said, "Whatever. You can call it whatever you like." Glenn couldn't help but laugh as he watched the two quarreling endlessly. At this time, Scott came to his side and sat down. He stared blankly at the depths of the dark passage for a long time before slowly opening his mouth. "Are we going to continue walking in?" Glenn heard this and sighed. He pointed at the megalodon rats on the ground and said, "Although their attack power isn't strong, there are too many of them. We can't kill them all." Scordell nodded silently, but didn't say anything. Glenn continued, "Their numbers are a danger. The most dangerous thing about them is that they are too fast. Of course, the speed I'm talking about isn't just their running speed. There's another kind of speed that is even more frightening." Scott was curious when he saw Glenn's serious face. If Glenn had such an expression, it meant that the situation was very serious. He couldn't help but ask, "These megalodon rats, what kind of speed is more frightening?" Glenn gently touched his bandaged wound and said word by word, "The speed of the megalodon rat's bite." Scott was even more curious when he heard Glenn's answer. He couldn't help but ask again, "Are these megalodon rats' bite speed very fast?" Glenn nodded. "These megalodon rats can give you a big wound in the blink of an eye." At this point, the fear on Glenn's face became more intense. "If we were to fall to the ground during a battle, with their eating speed, I'm afraid we would be eaten up before we could stand up." Scott's expression changed drastically when he heard this. If these megalodon rats could really cause such great damage, it would be too terrifying. He couldn't help but confirm again. These little fellas, are they really that powerful? Glenn nodded silently. After a while, he said, "These megalodon rats are definitely very scary." After Glenn said this, the two of them lost interest in talking and the place fell into silence. After a long time, Scott asked slowly, "Since these megalodon rats are so powerful, I think we should retreat." Glenn shook his head and said frankly, "To be honest, if it were me, I'd definitely go in and take a look." At this point, Green turned his head and glanced at his brothers not far away before continuing. "However, I'm not the only one, so I'd like to ask for everyone's opinion. If you're willing to go forward, you can follow me. If not, you can go forward." At this point, Glenn patted Scott's shoulder and said with a smile, "If you're not willing to go forward with me, I'll have to trouble you to bring them back safely." When Scott heard this, he immediately refused. "Captain, no, I can't let you take the risk. If you want to go, we'll go together. As long as you continue to go forward, I won't back out." Glenn shook his head. "Scott, you don't have to take the risk with me. I know it's dangerous, but you also know that I'm a very curious person. The more dangerous a place is, the more I want to go in and take a look. Otherwise, even if I go back, I won't be at peace." Scott heard this and shook his head. "I'm suggesting to back out, not because I'm afraid of death, and not because I'm not curious. I'm just thinking about the big picture, and I'm afraid that my brothers will suffer losses." At this point, Scott smiled. "If there's a chance to take the risk, I definitely won't let go of it." At this moment, the archer of the Gale Mercenary Corps, Kaiden, walked over with a smile. "What are the two captains talking about?" Chapter 53. Seeing Kaiden coming over, Green pointed to his side and said with a smile, "Come, sit down and talk." Carlton nodded and sat down beside Green without hesitation. Glenn asked after Kaiden sat down, "Scott and I were talking about whether we should leave or move on. Since you're here, tell me, should we leave or move on?" Hearing this, K.A. Dunn smiled and said, "I guess you two are talking about this." Kaiden turned his eyes to the depths of the tunnel and said with a smile, "I think it must be very dangerous in here." Glenn nodded. "Just by looking at those large-toothed rats, we should be able to guess that there must be something more dangerous hiding in the endless darkness, waiting for an opportunity to strike." Kaiden sighed. "I really didn't expect. When I first came out, I thought that the mission would be completed after finding the Nightmare Eagle. But I didn't expect to encounter so many things. Especially in this tunnel. No one would have thought that there would be so many large-toothed rats hiding in this tunnel. It's really surprising." Scott nodded. "Yeah, basically no one has been here before. It's understandable that no one has discovered it." Glenn suddenly said, "You're wrong. It's not necessarily that no one has been here before. Maybe many people have been here before." Scott was puzzled. If people have been here before, why haven't we heard of it? Ah! At the end of his sentence, Scott suddenly cried out. He turned to look at Glenn and asked in a trembling voice, "You mean?" Glenn nodded. "It's true that this place is far from Cold Moon City. But if we can find this place, I'm sure other mercenary groups can find it too. But we haven't heard anything about this place. This means, speaking of this," Green sighed and continued, "we haven't heard any news about this place. I think it's because those who came here never left." Hearing this, K.A. Dunn was also shocked. He subconsciously looked into the dark tunnel, as if some terrifying monster would rush out from the darkness at any time. Scott was stunned for a moment before asking hesitantly, "Commander, since you know that it's dangerous inside, why do you still want to go in and take a look?" Green smiled and patted Scott's shoulder. He then turned to look at the dark passage. "Scott, my good brother, don't you know that the more dangerous a place is, the more likely it is to hide a great fortune?" When Scott heard this, he replied subconsciously, "But the possibility of success in such a dangerous place is almost zero." Green laughed. "How would you know if you don't try?" Scott sighed. "I think those who entered the passage and couldn't come out were thinking the same thing as you. They all wanted to go in and try, but in the end, they couldn't come back. Hearing this, Green nodded. Scott, you're right, I think so too. Before everyone went in, they felt that they would succeed. But in the end, they all failed and stayed in this passage forever. Scott saw that Green also understood what he meant. For a moment, he couldn't think of any words to persuade him. Once again, the field became quiet. After a long while, Scott suddenly said, I have an idea. Relatively speaking, it's a bit safer. Green heard this and turned to look at him. What idea? Tell me. Scott said, we can wait outside and wait for the Raymond family's experts to arrive. Then, we can enter the passage with them. At that time, with their help, I think our chances of success will be a lot higher, and our danger will also be reduced a lot. Scott saw that Green was about to say something, so he hurriedly continued. With the help of those experts, although our profits will be much lower, our safety will also be guaranteed. This can be considered a good idea. Hearing this, Green silently nodded and thought about Scott's idea. At this time, Kaiden, who had been listening to the conversation, suddenly said, this passage is too dangerous. Needless to say, there are other dangers, but we can't deal with these large-toothed rats. I feel that with the strength of our mercenary group, it will be really difficult to deal with them. Green thought for a long time, then slowly raised his head and said slowly, in that case, let's wait for them to come. When the time comes, we will enter the passage together. Seeing that Green was finally willing to withdraw, Scott was immediately overjoyed. To be honest, he didn't want to enter this passage again no matter what. Even if there were huge benefits, he still didn't want to go. Although they would have to wait for those experts to come and enter again, with their help, the danger of entering the passage would definitely be reduced a lot. Since the matter had been decided, Green didn't delay any longer and directly ordered all the mercenaries to withdraw from the passage. Seeing that there were no more bats in the huge space, Mu Hongi led everyone and slowly walked into the big space. Walking into the big space, everyone began to split up to check the situation inside. There was nothing strange in the big space. There were 3 passages leading to unknown places on the opposite side, and one to the left and one to the right of the passage they came from. In the entire large space, there was nothing else other than these few passageways. After everyone checked to see if there were any new discoveries, they found a corner and sat down. At this moment, one of the guards suddenly pointed up and said loudly, "Look, there's another passage up there." Hearing this, everyone hurriedly looked in the direction that the guard was pointing. Sure enough, on the opposite side of the rock wall, there was really a dark passage high above the ground. Looking from afar, they could see a protruding rock wall at the bottom of the passage. If they stood in the big space and looked at it from another angle, they could only see the rock wall but not the passage. Looking at these passages in the big space, everyone hesitated for a moment. Which passage should they go to next? Hudaki walked to Mu Hongi's side and asked, "Big brother, which passage should we choose?" Mu Hongi shook his head. "This place is full of strangeness. I feel that if we choose the wrong passage, there might be a huge danger waiting for us after entering it." Shenfeisha looked around and said, "Big brother is right. I don't know where those big bats are hiding. If they appear, we won't be able to deal with them." Chapter 54. As Mu Hongi looked at the several tunnels in the large space, he pondered which tunnel he should enter. After thinking for a while, he looked at the 2 tunnels on both sides of the tunnel that he had entered from. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat. Could these 2 tunnels also be entrances? If there were also 2 entrances, then where did these 2 entrances lead to? What kind of danger could there be in these 2 tunnels? After thinking for a while, Mu Hongi finally made up his mind. Let's take a look at the 2 tunnels that seemed to be exits first. Mu Hongi felt that the monsters in these 2 tunnels shouldn't be that strong. As for the 3 tunnels on the other side, the monsters in them should be much stronger than the monsters here. Thinking of this, Mu Hongi looked around at the people around him and slowly said, "Let's go. Let's take these 2 tunnels and see what's here." Everyone was hesitant as well. They didn't know which tunnel to choose. Seeing that their big brother had said so, no one objected. They all agreed. Seeing that no one objected, Mu Hongi immediately gave the order to set off. Everyone followed the left tunnel and walked into the dark tunnel once again. This time, Mu Hongi personally walked in front to check for any sudden attacks from monsters. After walking for a while, Mu Hongi felt that the road under his feet was slanting downwards. He couldn't help but think to himself, could it be that this tunnel leads underground? Mu Hongi and the others had entered the tunnel from halfway up the mountain. Now that the tunnel was slanting downwards, Mu Hongi suspected that this tunnel led underground. Not long after Mu Hongi and the others left, the sound of wings flapping could be heard from the big space that they had just left. Countless bats flew out from the tunnel high up. Because there were so many of them, when they flew out from the tunnel, they gathered into a torrent. They were like a red ribbon that flew out continuously from the tunnel. Piak piak piak. Soon, these red bats landed on the walls and made that sound again. It didn't take long for the empty space to be filled with countless red bats again. Everyone didn't know how long they had been walking. Mu Hongi, who was walking in front, suddenly waved his hand, indicating for everyone to stop. Everyone, stop for a moment. There seems to be a sound in front. Hearing this, everyone stopped and listened carefully to the situation in front. Squeak squeak. The voice was very weak, but everyone could still recognize it. Mu Hongi frowned and turned to look at the crowd. He asked curiously, "What is this sound? Which one of you can tell?" Hearing this, everyone shook their heads, indicating that they had never heard of this voice. Mu Hongi thought for a moment before continuing, "We've already come this far. Let's continue moving forward. Everyone must be careful on the road ahead." Everyone nodded in agreement. Mu Hongi then turned around and took the lead to walk forward again. Creak, creak. As the group cautiously advanced, the voices in their ears grew louder and louder. Before long, one of Zhong Qiuming's guards suddenly whispered, "This voice sounds like a mouse." Hearing this, everyone hurriedly listened carefully to the source of the voice. After a long while, Hudaki nodded and said, "It does sound like a mouse." Everyone also recognized this voice. After hearing Hudaki's confirmation, they were slightly relieved. They felt that they were just some rats. There was really nothing to be afraid of. Mu Hongi turned around and saw everyone's relaxed faces. He couldn't help but remind them, even if there are some rats ahead, everyone must still be careful. Who knows what kind of rats are ahead? Don't let your guard down. At this moment, Zhong Meng, who was in the crowd, suddenly picked up a stone from the ground and threw it into the tunnel. Piak piak piak. After the stone was thrown out, it hit the rock wall again. After a series of sounds, it flew into the depths of the dark tunnel. Following the sound of the stone hitting the rock wall, the strange sounds in the tunnel suddenly increased. Squeak squeak, squeak squeak. After hearing this sound, everyone didn't pay too much attention. After all, everyone was a master. It wasn't too easy to deal with some small rats. Just as everyone was paying no attention, Zhong Meng suddenly said, "Those things seem to be coming this way." After Zhong Meng's words, everyone hurriedly held their breaths again and listened to the sounds in the tunnel. Squeak squeak. Indeed, everyone could hear that the sounds seemed to be much closer. Mu Hongi was the first to draw out his bright ray sword. At the same time, he ordered everyone to prepare for battle. In this dangerous tunnel, no one dared to be careless. Even though they were facing some small rats, no one dared to let their guard down. Everyone was a master who had been through hundreds of battles. Naturally, they knew that no matter what, they couldn't let their guard down. Otherwise, if something went wrong, they would lose their lives. Just as everyone was preparing, the sounds got louder. Evidently, the distance between the two parties was getting closer. Squeak squeak. After a while, the sounds in the tunnel got louder. At this moment, the relaxed expressions on everyone's faces disappeared completely. What replaced it was a look of suspicion and caution. Even if a normal rat were to make a sound, it wouldn't be that loud. But the sounds coming from the depths of the tunnel were much louder than a normal rat's. It was only at this moment that everyone remembered. Since bats could become so big, what reason did the rats have to not become so big? Squeak squeak. As the sounds in the tunnel got louder, everyone's faces got uglier and uglier. The sounds coming from the depths of the tunnel were not only loud, but there were also many of them. Squeak squeak, squeak squeak. These sounds were no longer as continuous as they were at the beginning. Instead, they were chaotic. It was as if there were countless rats squeaking at the same time. It was almost impossible to tell what the rats were squeaking about. All that was left was a series of squeaking noises. The two brothers, Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong, looked at each other and nodded at the same time. Immediately, they raised the sabers in their hands and took a few steps forward. They passed by Mu Hongyi and came to the front. The tunnel wasn't wide. It could only allow two people to fight side by side. Any more and they would affect each other. Seeing the two brothers rushing forward, Mu Hongyi did not say anything. He just stared at the depths of the tunnel, waiting for the monsters to arrive. Squeak squeak, the sounds coming from the tunnel got louder and louder. The sounds were chaotic, echoing in the dark tunnel. This continuous noise made everyone feel frustrated. They couldn't wait to rush up and kill all the monsters that were rushing over so that the tunnel would be peaceful again. Chapter 55. The sound from the depths of the darkness grew louder and louder. Everyone could already hear the rustling sound. Although they didn't know what the sound was, everyone could guess that it was the footsteps of the monsters that were rushing over. Soon, the sound got closer and closer. Even the creaking sound of the monsters' claws scratching the walls could be heard clearly. Everyone understood that these monsters were about to rush over. Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong were so nervous that their palms were sweating. When they heard that the monsters were about to rush over, they couldn't help but grab the hilt of their swords. At the same time, they raised the swords in their hands to the easiest place to attack. Only then did they stare at the dark tunnel. At this moment, Shenfeisha, who was standing in the crowd, was so scared that his face turned ashen. This wasn't to say that he was a coward. It was just that after seeing the tide of red bats, he already had a certain fear of these creatures in his heart. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that if he was the only one here, he would definitely turn around and run without hesitation. Mu Hongyi turned his head and saw Shenfeisha's ashen face. He immediately felt a little unhappy. Could it be that some small rats scared you to this extent? Just as Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong were nervously looking at the tunnel in front of them. Suddenly, a black shadow came out of the darkness and pounced at Zhong Yundao like lightning. Facing the attack of the black shadow, Zhong Yundao naturally didn't dare to be careless. He flipped the long sword in his hand slightly and the black shadow, as if walking into a trap, crashed into the long sword in his hand. Immediately, it let out a sizzling sound and hung on the long sword in Mu Hongyi's hand, motionless. It was also at this moment that everyone saw clearly what the monster that pounced over looked like. It was really no different from what everyone had guessed. It was a rat. The only difference was that this rat was much bigger than a normal rat. It was at least 10 times bigger. Everyone carefully looked at the huge rat hanging on Zhong Yuntao's saber and couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. Not only was this rat big, it also looked very fierce. Its 4 sharp claws had been rubbed against the rocks all year round. They had long been sharpened and emitted a dark light. The scariest thing was that there were 4 long fangs in front of the rat's mouth. These 4 fangs shone with a cold light under the dim red light. No one dared to doubt the damage it could cause. Creak, creak. The rats that Mu Hongyi and the others encountered were the same rats that the Fierce Wind mercenary group had encountered. While Mu Hongyi and the others were still in a daze, a few more large-toothed rats rushed up. Zhong Yundao did not dare to be negligent. He hurriedly swung the tip of his saber and flung the hanging large-toothed rat to the side. Then, he pointed the saber forward and stabbed a large-toothed rat that was charging over. A large group of large-toothed rats had already rushed up. Although Zhong Yundao had killed 1 large-toothed rat, a few more large-toothed rats were rushing up from the cliff. Seeing this, Zhong Yuntao's expression changed. He did not bother to get rid of the giant-toothed rat hanging on his saber. Instead, he hurriedly brandished his saber and slashed at the few giant-toothed rats that were charging at him from the rock wall. Although the few large-toothed rats that were rushing over from the cliff wall were very fast, the saber in Zhong Yuntao's hand was definitely not to be trifled with. A cold light flashed in front of him, and 3 large-toothed rats that had rushed over from the rock wall were swept away by him, and fell to the ground. Although Zhong Yundao had blocked these 3 giant-toothed rats, there were more and more giant-toothed rats rushing over. Just as Zhong Yundao withdrew his saber, more than a dozen giant-toothed rats rushed over from the ground and the rock wall. Zhong Yundao did not dare to hold back anymore. He immediately waved the saber in his hand and swept it in front of him. The saber flashed past, and suddenly, there was a burst of screams in front of Zhong Yundao. The next moment, more than a dozen giant-toothed rats that had rushed over in front of him were swept away by Zhong Yundao. At that time, when the Fierce Wind mercenary group was dealing with these giant-toothed rats, it was not as easy as Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji. Of course, this did not mean that Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji's martial arts were better than theirs. It was because Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji both used short sabers. In this narrow passage, their sabers could be extended freely. Lowell was fighting very hard at that time. On the other hand, Field, who was beside him, seemed to be slightly more relaxed. This did not mean that Field was better than Lowell. It was just that the mace in Lowell's hand was too long. In this passage, it could not be extended. Zhong Yundao killed more than a dozen giant-toothed rats in a short period of time. Lan Ji, who was beside him, killed more giant-toothed rats than he did. Although the two of them slashed wildly, there were too many giant-toothed rats. It was as if there was no end to them. As soon as Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji cleared the area in front of them, more giant-toothed rats immediately rushed over. Seeing that there were more and more giant-toothed rats in front of them, Hudaki suddenly took out a white arrow from behind his back and knocked it on the bowstring. Then, he slowly began to draw the bow. Just as Hudaki was drawing the bow, a breeze began to gather around him. After a while, he suddenly shouted, "Zhong Yundao, get down." The few of them had been together for many years and had cooperated with each other many times in battle. At this moment, Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji, who were in front of them, heard Hudaki's shout and immediately understood. They began to exert their strength at the same time and swung their swords with all their might. They swept away all the giant-toothed rats in front of them and immediately got down on the ground. Not long after the two of them got down, Hudaki shouted again, "Wave arrow." As soon as Hudaki finished speaking, his fingers loosened and the white arrow on the bowstring rolled up a gust of wind and flew into the dark passage. Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji only felt a gust of wind blow over their heads. In the next moment, they heard the screams of the giant-toothed rats in front of them. The white arrow contained the true power that Hudaki poured into it. It rolled up a gust of wind and flew towards the large group of giant-toothed rats that were rushing over. When the white arrow flew over, all the giant-toothed rats within a 1-meter radius of the arrow were blown into pieces by the gust of wind. After the white arrow flew over and cleared out a large group of giant-toothed rats, it crashed into the rock wall and fell to the ground. At this moment, Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji stood up and once again waved the swords in their hands and slashed at the remaining giant-toothed rats. Although Hudaki's move was powerful, it had a small range. Only the giant-toothed rats within a 1-meter radius of the white arrow were affected. The giant-toothed rats outside of this range were not affected at all and continued to rush towards Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji. Although there were still many giant-toothed rats rushing over, compared to before, there were much fewer of them. Chapter 56. After Hudaki's wave arrow flew past, it also bought a moment for Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji to catch their breath. However, it was really only a moment. Soon, a large number of large-toothed rats rushed out of the darkness again, squeaking and rushing towards Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji who were in front of them. Faced with a large number of large-toothed rats rushing over, Zhong Yundao and Lan Ji were once again in danger. Mu Hongyi saw that the situation in front was critical and could not help but frown. He lowered his head and thought for a moment before turning back and saying, "There are too many large-toothed rats in front. Let's all take turns to use our skills to attack those large-toothed rats." Hearing this, everyone nodded their heads one after another. The situation was critical now. If they did not think of a way, they were afraid that everyone would be trapped here. Everyone rubbed their fists and began to prepare to use their best skills. Seeing that everyone was almost ready, Mu Hongyi asked in a low voice, "Who will go first?" As soon as Mu Hongyi's voice fell, Fan Shouwu took the initiative to walk in front of him and said, "My martial arts skills are low. Let me throw a brick to attract the jade first." Hearing this, Mu Hongyi nodded. It did not matter who went first. Anyway, there seemed to be an endless number of large-toothed rats rushing over. Everyone would have a chance to use their best skills. Seeing that Fan Shouwu was ready, Mu Hongyi immediately shouted to Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong in front of him. Zhong Yundao, Lan Zhiyong, the two of you listen carefully. When we attack later, quickly get down. Hearing this, Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong quickly responded. At the same time, they were overjoyed. If their big brother did not think of a way, they were afraid that they would not be able to hold on for long. There were too many large-toothed rats in front of them. Even if the two brothers were strong in martial arts, they had already been bitten several times by these little things. If this continued, the two brothers might die here. Seeing that Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong were ready, Mu Hongyi said to Fan Shouwu, "Let's begin." Fan Shouwu nodded and immediately drew out his cold light sword. At the same time, he began to silently use his internal breath. When his internal strength was raised to the maximum, he suddenly shouted at Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong in front of him. "Get down." Zhong Yundao had been waiting for this moment for a long time. After listening to Fan Shouwu's words, they immediately lay down on the ground without hesitation. Seeing this, Fan Shouwu immediately took 2 steps forward, arriving in front of the two, and shouted, "Stars." As soon as Fan Shouwu finished speaking, a ball of starlight rose from the cold light sword in his hand. In the blink of an eye, it transformed into a dozen dazzling cold stars in front of him. A moment later, a few cold stars flew into the distant darkness and landed on the charging pack of large-toothed rats. Creak, 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 creak. Following Fan Shouwu's chilling stars, a large number of large-toothed rats began to cry out in pain. Very quickly, a large number of them were cleared out. Although Fan Shouwu's move was quite powerful, his strength was still too low. In the blink of an eye, his ultimate move, Vast Stars, had disappeared in front of him. When Fan Shouwu saw that his ultimate move had disappeared, he hurriedly retreated a few steps and dodged to the side. Wave Arrow. Just as Fan Shouwu retreated to the side of the cliff, Hudaki's wave arrow flew out from the bowstring, bringing with it a strong gust of wind as it rushed towards a large number of large-toothed rats. Next. Shenfeisha, Heart-Destroying Fist. Zhong Qiuming, Long Rainbow. Mu Hongyi, Flowing Light. Everyone took turns to use their ultimate moves. At this moment, Zhong Meng realized that none of these people were mediocre. Everyone had their own ultimate moves, and each of their ultimate moves were quite extraordinary. This was an eye-opener for him. Although everyone's ultimate moves were very powerful, there were simply too many of these large-toothed rats. It was almost as if there was no end to them. It was only until everyone's inner energy was depleted that the number of large-toothed rats gradually decreased. At this moment, the tunnel in front of them was almost completely filled with large-toothed rats. If it weren't for their super-powerful ultimate moves, this tunnel would have been completely blocked by these large-toothed rats. When Mu Hongyi saw that the number of large-toothed rats was decreasing, he was slightly relieved. He knew that the crisis had passed and hurriedly waved his hand, indicating for everyone to stop. After everyone received the order and saw that there weren't many large-toothed rats rushing towards them, they all let out a long sigh of relief and collapsed on the ground. Just now, everyone took turns to use their ultimate moves. After a long period of using them, their inner energy had long been depleted. If those large-toothed rats hadn't been eliminated, they were afraid that their side would be in danger next. Zhong Meng walked towards the pale-faced Fan Shouwu and sat down in front of him, asking with a smile, "How are you? Are you all right?" At this moment, although Fan Shouwu's face was pale, his expression was filled with joy. With his martial arts, he was actually able to fight side by side with an expert like Mu Hongyi. This was something that he didn't even dare to think about in the past. The fierce brothers, Lord Mu and the others are really powerful. Today, I'm lucky enough to see them use their ultimate moves. It's really admirable. Zhong Meng nodded. Their martial arts are indeed very powerful. However, your martial arts aren't bad either. When Fan Shouwu heard this, he said somewhat embarrassedly, "My martial arts are simply too weak compared to theirs." Just as everyone was talking, Zhong Yundao, who had been fighting at the front, suddenly shouted loudly, "Big brother, there are no more rats rushing towards us." Mu Hongyi nodded and shouted at Zhong Yundao, "Since there are no more rats, the two of you should take turns to rest. Don't let your guard down. In this battle, although Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong were at the front, the two of them didn't use much energy. After the two of them fought for a while, Mu Hongyi ordered everyone to take turns to use their ultimate moves to attack the large-toothed rats that were rushing towards them. Ever since Fan Shouwu made his move, Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong had been lying on the ground without moving. This was because they couldn't move. Everyone was constantly using their ultimate moves to attack the large-toothed rats above them. If they dared to stand up, they would definitely end up like the large-toothed rats. Later on, when Mu Hongyi saw that there weren't many large-toothed rats rushing towards them, he let the two of them clean up the mess. Hudaki looked at the passageway that had returned to normal. After thinking for a while, he turned to look at Mu Hongyi and asked, "Big brother, are we still going forward?" After listening to Hudaki's question, Mu Hongyi didn't hesitate this time and nodded directly. "We can only continue forward. I'm guessing that this is the passageway that leads to the outside. If we don't open up this passageway, it would be terrible if there's danger inside." Chapter 57. Mu Hongyi was right. If they did not open up the exit and continued to go deeper, they would not have a chance to escape with the large-toothed rats blocking their way even if they wanted to. Hudaki nodded when he heard this. "I didn't expect that there would be such a place besides the Nightmare Eagle." Mu Hongyi was silent for a while before he spoke slowly. "Our current location shouldn't be too far from the entrance. Logically speaking, the further in we go, the more dangerous it will be. However, we almost couldn't deal with these monsters at the entrance. If we continue to go deeper, I'm afraid that there will be more powerful monsters." Hudaki thought for a while and said, "Brother, you should be right. Big brother, what you said should be right. There must be even more powerful monsters inside." Hudaki hesitated for a while before he continued, "I'm thinking, what if we don't go in?" Mu Hongyi was stunned when he heard this. Then, he smiled and said, "Aren't you curious about the things inside?" Hudaki shook his head. "This is not a question of curiosity. We almost couldn't deal with the monsters here. If a large number of more powerful monsters appear, we will definitely be injured." Mu Hongyi nodded when he heard this. Hudaki was right. If more powerful monsters appeared, they would definitely be injured. However, should they just retreat like this? Mu Hongyi was not willing to do so. Great benefits were often hidden in great danger. Mu Hongyi was very clear about this. Although Mu Hongyi was a Xiantian master, he felt that he had not made much progress after entering the Xiantian realm and after so many years of cultivation. However, Mu Hongyi was also very clear that it was quite difficult to improve again after entering the Xiantian realm. He was not the only one who felt this feeling of slow progress. All Xiantian masters felt this. If they wanted to break through again, they had to think of a way. Mu Hongyi had once heard people say that the reason why many experts were able to break through was because of some treasures. Mu Hongyi was just a guard captain. It was not easy for him to obtain high-level treasures. Then, was there any treasure in this passage that could help him break through? This was the question that Mu Hongyi had been thinking about. Hudaki saw that his brother did not speak, so he hurriedly asked again, "Big brother, do you really want to go inside?" Mu Hongyi was silent for a long time before he slowly nodded and said seriously, "I do want to take a look inside and see what's inside." Hudaki was a little anxious when he heard that and hurriedly stopped him. "Big brother, you mustn't do that. We don't even know what dangers lie ahead. Furthermore, we have the son of the deputy prefectural governor in our group. If anything happens to Fan Gongzi, we won't be able to bear the consequences. Big brother, you have to reconsider." Mu Hongyi shook his head. "The reason why I want to leave through this passage is because I want to send all of you out and then enter this place alone." When Hudaki heard this, he became even more anxious. "Big brother, how can you do this? It's impossible for you to pass through this passage by yourself." Mu Hongyi looked into the depths of the passage and sighed. "I also know that it may be very dangerous inside, but if I don't try, how can I know what's inside?" Hudaki also sighed. "Big brother, even if it were those rats that we encountered just now, it would be difficult for you to deal with them alone. If there are more dangerous monsters, you won't have a chance to escape. Big brother, No matter what, you have to think carefully. Mu Hongi looked at Hudaki and patted him on the shoulder with a smile. Second brother, you don't have to worry about me. If I really encounter a powerful monster inside, I think that with my martial arts, even if I can't defeat it, I should be able to escape without a problem. When Hudaki heard this, he wanted to persuade him again but was stopped by Mu Hongi. Second brother, I've made up my mind. You don't have to persuade me anymore. I know your good intentions. Although the conversation between Mu Hongi and Hudaki was not loud, Zhongmeng still heard it clearly. Zhongmeng thought for a moment and turned to look at Fan Shouwu. He asked with a smile, Fan Gongzi, if you had a choice, would you choose to continue searching for treasures inside? When Fan Shouwu heard this, he shook his head. It's too dangerous here. The rats we encountered and the bats over there should be the lowest level monsters according to their distribution. However, even these lowest level monsters are quite difficult for me to deal with. If we continue to go in, I'm afraid it will be even more dangerous. I think I still have some self-awareness. When Zhongmeng heard this, he reached out and patted Fan Shouwu on the shoulder. You're smart. You know it's dangerous, so you don't go. At this point, Zhongmeng lowered his voice and asked, guess if there's anyone here who isn't afraid of the danger and wants to continue going in. Fan Shouwu thought for a moment and then shook his head. I don't think so. When we were dealing with those rats just now, you saw that everyone used almost all their strength to eliminate those rats. If we encounter more powerful monsters, we will definitely be wiped out. Zhongmeng smiled and shook his head. You're wrong. There must be someone who isn't afraid of the danger and wants to go in and take a look. When Fan Shouwu heard this, he shook his head. I don't believe it. It's so dangerous here. If we're not careful, we might lose our lives. Who would be so stupid to want to go in and search for treasures? When Zhongmeng heard this, he laughed in his heart. Fan Shouwu had guessed wrong. At least, Mu Hongi wanted to go in and take a look. Of course, this included Zhongmeng. Zhongmeng wasn't afraid of any danger here. What he wanted to do the most was to find an experienced person to enter this passage with him and explore inside. Why did he want to find an experienced person? Of course, there was a reason for that. If Zhongmeng entered the passage by himself and beat up the monsters he saw, he was afraid that all the monsters here would be beaten to a pulp by him. However, why did Zhongmeng want to enter this passage? The main reason was to get some gold coins to spend. After all, there were so many people in the village. If there wasn't a large amount of gold coins, the people in the village wouldn't be able to live a good life. The problem was that Zhongmeng didn't know what was valuable. This was very awkward. If Zhongmeng randomly beat all the monsters into a pulp, then all he would gain would be a large pile of meat paste. There wouldn't be anything valuable. Chapter 58. Everyone rested for a while. When Mu Hongi saw that everyone's strength had recovered, he immediately ordered them to continue moving forward. Along the way, it was still Zhong Yundao and his brother who led the way. Everyone followed closely behind and moved forward cautiously. Although most of the large-toothed rats had been eliminated, there were still sporadic large-toothed rats that rushed out from the darkness and ambushed everyone. But without exception, they were all killed by Zhong Yundao and his brother who were leading the way. Everyone was moving forward and exploring when suddenly, Zhong Yundao who was leading the way suddenly shouted, "Big brother, there seems to be a big space in front." Mu Hongi heard and immediately ordered them to stop moving forward. Then, he let Zhong Yundao go forward alone to check out the situation. Zhong Yundao responded and walked forward with the steel saber in his hand. Zhong Yundao walked very carefully, afraid that he would attract some monsters to rush over. Not long after, Zhong Yundao walked to the big space that he had seen earlier. In the dark tunnel, the reason why Zhong Yundao could see the large space was that there was more red in the large space. Therefore, he could see more clearly in the dark. He could see a large area of faint red from afar. Zhong Yundao looked at the big space not far away and stopped to listen carefully. Then, he couldn't help but frown. Looking at the big space from where he was, although he didn't see any danger, he could hear a familiar sound. Squeak squeak. Although there weren't many of these sounds, Zhong Yundao couldn't guarantee that there weren't many large-toothed rats in this big space. Zhong Yundao took a deep breath and held his breath. He slowed down his footsteps and walked towards the tunnel of the big space. Along the way, Zhong Yuntao's footsteps were very light and didn't cause too much of a disturbance. Even the familiar sounds from the big space didn't change much. Zhong Yundao was slightly relieved when he felt that he didn't disturb the monsters in the big space. When he reached the tunnel of the big space, he stopped again and slowly exhaled. Then, he took another slow breath and held the steel sword in his hand tightly. He looked into the big space. This large space was similar to the large space filled with bats. However, there weren't many monsters in this space. Zhong Yundao only saw a small number of megalodon rats on the ground grinding their teeth. Zhong Yundao carefully observed the space and found that there were 2 passages on the opposite side. His heart couldn't help but tremble. Could it be that one of the passages leads to the outside? After observing for a while, Zhong Yundao slowly retracted his head and turned around to return the way he came. After listening to Zhong Yuntao's explanation, Mu Hongyi pondered in his heart. It seems that the big space was where these big rats lived. He had just eliminated all the big rats, so there weren't many of them left in this space. Thinking of this, Mu Hongyi turned to look at the crowd and said in a low voice, "Ahead should be the gathering place of the big rats. However, we have already eliminated most of the big rats. There should only be a small number of rats left. Wait a moment, brothers, let's work harder and try to eliminate all the remaining big rats." After a while, Mu Hongyi saw that everyone understood what he meant, so he immediately waved his hand and said in a low voice, "Brothers, let's set off now to eliminate those big rats." When the crowd heard this, they all stood up, took out their weapons and followed behind Mu Hongyi. Soon, Mu Hongyi led everyone to the passage of the large space. He first waved his hand to signal everyone to stop. Then, he personally went forward to observe the large space. Seeing that the situation in the large space was no different from what Zhong Yundao had said, he turned around and said to everyone in a low voice, "There aren't many big rats left in there. Everyone, get ready. We will rush in now and try to eliminate all of them." Hearing this, everyone nodded. Mu Hongyi turned his head to look at everyone again. He looked at the large space again and saw that there were no changes. Then, he shouted, "Brothers, let's rush in and eliminate these hateful big rats." As he spoke, Mu Hongyi took the lead and rushed into the large space. Seeing this, everyone didn't dare to be negligent. They all picked up their weapons and rushed into the large space. Even though these large-toothed rats had grown bigger, they were still vigilant. Mu Hongyi's shout was heard by all of the large-toothed rats. Seeing that an outsider had intruded into their territory, the large-toothed rats were enraged. They stood up quickly and rushed in the direction of the voice. At this moment, the large space, which was initially quiet, suddenly became noisy. Squeak squeak, squeak squeak, countless large-toothed rats ran out from all directions. Originally, there weren't many large-toothed rats on the ground. But after Mu Hongyi's shout, countless shadows of large-toothed rats appeared from the ground. They squeaked and rushed in this direction. Looking at the large group of large-toothed rats rushing over, Mu Hongyi regretted it. He was a little careless. Initially, he saw that there weren't many large-toothed rats left on the ground in the large space. That was why he wanted his brothers to rush into the large space and wipe out the remaining large-toothed rats. This would save them a lot of time. But he didn't expect that there would be so many large-toothed rats. Mu Hongyi looked at them for a long time, but he still couldn't figure out where these large-toothed rats came from. But now that things had come to this, regret wouldn't solve the problem. Looking at the large group of large-toothed rats rushing towards him, Mu Hongyi immediately waved the bright ray sword in his hand and shouted, "Flowing light." Facing such a large number of large-toothed rats, Mu Hongyi knew clearly that normal sword skills wouldn't be able to solve the problem. Now, he could only rely on his ultimate move to deal with these despicable large-toothed rats. Just as Mu Hongyi's voice fell, the bright ray sword in his hand turned into a bright sword light. Like a waterfall flowing down from a mountain, it landed on the ground and created thousands of ripples. After the ripples spread out, it landed on the group of large-toothed rats that were rushing over. The large-toothed rats that were hit by the ripples were immediately smashed into pieces. Countless large-toothed rats cried out at the same time. In the blink of an eye, the large-toothed rats in front of Mu Hongi were all cleared. What was left were only fragments of the large-toothed rats. Zhong Meng didn't participate in the battle. He felt that although there were many large-toothed rats here, Mu Hongi and the others were definitely not to be trifled with. Each of them had strong martial arts skills. Dealing with these large-toothed rats shouldn't be a problem. Chapter 59. Mu Hongi used his ultimate move and instantly wiped out all the large-toothed rats within 5 meters in front of him. Everyone saw that their boss had already used his ultimate move and did not dare to be negligent. They hurriedly stood in a position where they would not affect the others and began to use their ultimate moves on the large-toothed rats that were rushing over. For a moment, the big space was filled with flashes of brilliance and the screams of the large-toothed rats could be heard everywhere. Although everyone's martial arts were powerful, there were too many large-toothed rats. Mu Hongi had just used his ultimate move to wipe out all the large-toothed rats in front of him. Just as he was about to catch his breath, he suddenly saw a large number of large-toothed rats rushing over. Helpless, Mu Hongi could only wave the bright ray sword in his hand again and roar. Flowing light. Mu Hongi continuously used his ultimate move to attack the large-toothed rats that were rushing over. The rest of his brothers were no exception. They were all continuously using their ultimate moves. In the face of such a large number of large-toothed rats, ordinary sword techniques could no longer block the attacks of these large-toothed rats. Now, they could only continuously use their ultimate moves to prevent these large-toothed rats from attacking them. Mu Hongi used his ultimate move 3 times in a row. When he saw that the number of large-toothed rats rushing over in front of him had not decreased, he felt even more regretful. If he had known this would happen, he would not have rushed in so rashly. Actually, Mu Hongi could not be blamed for underestimating the enemy. They had already eliminated countless large-toothed rats in the passageway and thought that there were not many large-toothed rats left. Who would have thought that there were still so many large-toothed rats here? Mu Hongi was holding a sharp sword and attacking these large-toothed rats that were rushing over was still manageable. Among this group of people, the ones who were fighting the hardest were Hudaki and Shinfeisha. Hudaki was a long-range attacker. In terms of long-range attacks, he could be said to be the well-deserved king among these people. However, in the face of such a large number of large-toothed rats, it was really difficult for him to fight. His ultimate move, the oscillating arrow, was also a powerful long-range attack. However, it could not hit the large-toothed rats that were close to him. In desperation, he could only dodge while desperately using the longbow in his hand to smash the large-toothed rats on the ground. However, the longbow was not used like this. Its purpose was to attack the enemy from a distance. It was not very powerful to smash it like a hammer. Most importantly, it was not that sturdy. Although the longbow in Hudaki's hand was made by him at a high price, it still couldn't be compared to the hammer. As soon as Hudaki activated his ultimate skill, he was shocked to find that many of the rats had already broken through the seal of his ultimate skill and were charging toward him. In desperation, Hudaki could only circulate his internal energy and wave the longbow in his hand, sweeping it in front of him. With Hudaki's inner energy, even if he was holding a wooden stick, as long as he channeled enough inner energy, he could still wipe out all the large-toothed rats in front of him. Hudaki waved the longbow in his hand and swept it in front of him. Countless megalodon rats were sent flying by the longbow in his hand. They screamed and fell to the ground, motionless. Although Hudaki's attack was ferocious, more and more large-toothed rats rushed over as soon as he wiped out the large-toothed rats in front of him. Left with no choice, Hudaki could only circulate his inner energy and wave the longbow in his hand with all his might, sending the large-toothed rats flying one by one. Relying on his profound inner energy, Hudaki could hold on for a long time, but the longbow in his hand couldn't hold on for that long. Hudaki didn't fight for long like this before he suddenly heard the sound of a bowstring breaking. He cursed in his heart and hurriedly put away the longbow to check it. With just one look, Hudaki was about to fly into a rage. The quality of a longbow all depended on the bowstring. The bowstring that he spent a lot of money to buy was actually broken. Hudaki was so angry that he screamed. Since the bowstring was already broken, there was no need for him to stay back. He gathered all his inner energy and used the longbow in his hand as an iron rod, desperately attacking the large-toothed rats that were charging toward him. However, without the support of his ultimate skill, it was still quite difficult to rely on this kind of attack to block the large-toothed rats. Not long after, Hudaki was bitten a few times by the large-toothed rats that were charging toward him. He was in so much pain that he screamed, but he didn't dare to stop. He could only wave the longbow even harder to block the large-toothed rats that were charging toward him. Although Hudaki was fighting very miserably, he was still not the most miserable person. In this battle, the most miserable person should be Shinfeisha. Shinfeisha was a close combat fighter. Logically speaking, he should be the best at dealing with these large-toothed rats that were charging toward him. However, in reality, this was not the case. Green of the Fierce Wind mercenary group once said that the most terrifying thing about these large-toothed rats was their eating speed. As long as these large-toothed rats rushed toward you, they would immediately eat your body as fast as lightning. Even if you immediately beat them into minced meat, they would still eat a lot of your things. Shinfeisha didn't realize this at first and was still full of confidence. However, not long after, he felt that something was wrong. Shinfeisha had just launched his ultimate skill, the heart-destroying fist, when he immediately realized that a few large-toothed rats had broken through his defense and were charging toward him. Seeing these large-toothed rats charging toward him, Shinfeisha didn't care at all. He immediately crossed his fists and struck out at the same time, hitting 2 of the large-toothed rats' heads and sending them flying. There were not only 2 large-toothed rats charging toward Shinfeisha, there were a total of 5 of them. After Shinfeisha sent 2 large-toothed rats flying, he immediately waved his fists and hit the other 2 large-toothed rats, sending them flying. Although Shinfeisha had sent 4 large-toothed rats flying in a row, there was still 1 large-toothed rat that broke through Shinfeisha's fist wind and continued to charge toward him. Seeing this, Shinfeisha didn't care at all. He was a close combat fighter and naturally had a good understanding of close combat. After so many years of training, he could almost use every part of his body as a weapon. Seeing this large-toothed rat break through his defense and charge toward him, Shinfeisha sneered. He lowered his arm slightly and his elbow struck the large-toothed rat that was charging toward him. Shinfeisha's timing was very accurate. His elbow accurately hit the large-toothed rat's head, as if he had been waiting for this large-toothed rat to charge toward him. Squeak, ooh-ah. The large-toothed rat was hit in the head by Shinfeisha's elbow. It immediately screamed and fell to the ground. But at the same time, Shinfeisha also felt a piercing pain coming from his elbow. He immediately screamed in pain and hurriedly retracted his arm. He saw that a large chunk of his elbow had been bitten by the large-toothed rat. Seeing this, Shinfeisha was shocked and angry. He didn't think that these hateful large-toothed rats would turn around and bite him when he hit them. Chapter 60. After Shinfeisha sent the large-toothed rat flying, he was bitten by the large-toothed rat himself. He immediately screamed in pain. Although he was in great pain, the large-toothed rats did not care whether he was in pain or not. They still rushed toward him crazily, wanting to give him more food. Seeing this, Shinfeisha could only endure the pain and use his ultimate skill again to wipe out the large-toothed rats that were rushing toward him. However, there were too many large-toothed rats. Although his ultimate skill was very powerful, he still could not wipe out all the large-toothed rats that were rushing toward him. Looking at the large-toothed rats that had broken through his ultimate skill and rushed toward him, Shinfeisha felt a chill in his heart. He subconsciously wanted to block them with his fist, but the pain on his elbow made him retract his fist. Although he did not want to fight these large-toothed rats with his bare hands, these large-toothed rats refused to let him go and continued to rush toward him without regard for their lives. In desperation, Shinfeisha could only lift his leg and sweep it across, kicking away a few of the large-toothed rats that were rushing toward him. After kicking out, Shinfeisha did not feel any pain from his leg. He was overjoyed. He knew that his leg was covered by his clothes and those large-toothed rats could not bite him. Thinking of this, Shinfeisha immediately regained his confidence. Even if he did not use his fists and only relied on his feet, he was still not afraid of these large-toothed rats. After all, he was a melee fighter with rich combat experience. However, after a few rounds of fighting, Shenfeisha suddenly realized that his clothes had been bitten off by those abominable large-toothed rats. Seeing this situation, Shenfeisha was so angry that his eyes were about to burst, but there was nothing he could do. He could only grit his teeth and continue fighting. Mu Hongyi and his brothers unleashed their invincible might and exterminated many large-toothed rats. However, there were simply too many large-toothed rats. Although they exterminated many large-toothed rats, there were still many large-toothed rats that broke through their defensive line and bit them. Hearing his brothers' continuous screams, Mu Hongyi was secretly anxious. He was so anxious that his mind was racing. He wanted to think of a way to change this situation. While Mu Hongyi was in a daze, a large-toothed rat had already broken through his defense line and bit him. Being bitten by a large-toothed rat was an absolutely terrifying thing. Mu Hongyi only felt pain on his body and subconsciously let out a scream. Although he quickly killed the rat, he still lost a lot of things. Compared to Mu Hongyi and his brothers, Fan Shouwu, Zhong Qiuming and the others were much better off. Mu Hongyi and his brothers blocked most of the large-toothed rats in front. Fan Shouwu and Zhong Qiuming only needed to deal with a small number of large-toothed rats running from the side. This way, they had to deal with fewer large-toothed rats. However, their martial arts were much weaker than Mu Hongyi and the others. Therefore, although they had to face fewer large-toothed rats, they were still flustered and in danger. Compared to Fan Shouwu and Zhong Qiuming, Fan Shouwu's ultimate skill, Myriad Stars, could be considered an ultimate skill that could be used for both offense and defense. It could be used for both long-range and close-range attacks, so it could be used to deal with these large-toothed rats. However, Zhong Qiuming was a little weak. His ultimate skill, Long Rainbow, was to use the three-sectioned spear in his hands to pierce out tens of meters, clearing out all the enemies in a straight line in front of him. It was quite powerful. However, against these tide-like large-toothed rats, clearing out all the enemies in a straight line in front of him was not enough. Although the battle had not been going on for long, Zhong Qiuming was already sweating profusely. Seeing that there were more and more large-toothed rats in front of him, Zhong Qiuming's eyes turned cold and he immediately let out a shout. Long Rainbow! Following his words, the three-sectioned spear in his hands turned into a long rainbow and pierced forward like a waterfall. Creak, creak. The three-sectioned spear pierced through tens of large-toothed rats in a row before stopping. Seeing that the three-sectioned spear had lost its momentum, Zhong Qiuming hurriedly shook his hands and the three-sectioned spear was quickly retracted. However, at this moment, tens of large-toothed rats had already rushed towards him from both sides. Seeing this, Zhong Qiuming was almost scared out of his wits. He hurriedly waved the three-sectioned spear in his hands and swept it away, but it was too late with his speed. When Zhong Qiuming's three-sectioned spear was halfway through sweeping, a few large-toothed rats had already rushed to his side. Zhong Qiuming knew that things were not going well, but there was nothing he could do. Just as he was about to wave his fist to block them, he saw a shadow flash by his side. Old Luo had already rushed up with his saber and blocked his side. The large-toothed rats themselves were not strong, but their terrifying part was their numbers. Like a tidal wave of large-toothed rats, no matter who they attacked, they would not be able to gain any advantage. Old Luo's steel saber slashed violently in front of him, and very soon, a few large-toothed rats had been eliminated. Zhong Qiuming saw that the danger on his side had been resolved, and only then did he feel slightly relieved. He could only say loudly, "Thank you very much." However, old Luo said with a serious expression, "Pay attention to the front." After Fan Shouwu used his ultimate skill, Stars, to sweep away all the large-toothed rats that were rushing towards him, he saw that there were more and more large-toothed rats rushing towards him from both sides. He thought for a moment and immediately shouted at Zhong Qiuming, "Everyone, gather around. Let's form a circle." When everyone heard this, they immediately understood and hurriedly retreated to Fan Shouwu's side. Everyone quickly stood side by side and formed the smallest circle. Of course, Mu Hongyi and the other four brothers were naturally not in this circle, as they were still fighting in front. This defensive circle was mainly formed by Zhong Qiuming, Fan Shouwu, and the guards that they had brought. There was a total of 8 people in the circle. After everyone formed this defensive circle, In addition to the fact that there were not many large-toothed rats rushing towards them from behind, for a moment, they were evenly matched with the large-toothed rats that were rushing towards them. Fan Shouwu, Zhong Qiuming, and the others stabilized their formation and formed a defensive circle, which made them much safer. The large-toothed rats' attack mainly relied on their numbers. They rushed in from all directions, and while you could block the front, you could not block the sides. If this went on, the large-toothed rats would sooner or later find your weakness and rush over. Everyone formed a defensive circle and only needed to face the enemies in front of them. The large-toothed rats on the sides would naturally be dealt with by the people on the sides. Zhong Meng hid at the entrance of the tunnel and carefully observed the situation in the large space. After looking for a while, he found out where the large-toothed rats came from. In this large space, other than the tunnel on the opposite side, there were 2 more tunnels on the side of the tunnel that Zhong Meng was standing on. These large numbers of large-toothed rats rushed out from these 2 tunnels. He did not know where they had been hiding before, but until now, Zhong Meng still saw many large-toothed rats rushing out from the tunnels. Chapter 61. Facing the endless large-toothed rats, Mu Hongyi was so regretful that his intestines turned green. Among these people, his martial arts were the highest. After entering this large space, although it had not been long, he had already used his ultimate skill 5 times in a row. Even if his inner strength was deep, he felt that he could not hold on any longer. Feeling that his inner strength was almost exhausted, Mu Hongyi could not help but look at the rest of his brothers. After seeing the situation of his brothers clearly, he was shocked. His 4 brothers were all pale and had injuries on their bodies. It seemed that they were all struggling to hold on. However, he was afraid that they would not be able to hold on for much longer. Mu Hongyi turned his head and saw the defensive circle formed by Fan Shouwu, Zhong Qiuming, and the others. His heart moved and he suddenly shouted, "All of you, come over here. We will also form a defensive circle and fight side by side." Hu Daqi and the others were already suffering from the battle. After hearing their big brother's shout, they immediately leaned over to him without hesitation. Although there were many large-toothed rats rushing over, under the full force of the 5 people, they still walked together and formed a defensive circle. However, there were only 4 of them fighting side by side on the periphery. Shen Feisha was already surrounded by the 4 people in the middle and could only catch his breath temporarily. Shen Feisha could not continue fighting. He was already injured all over. Whether it was his arms or legs, they were all bitten beyond recognition by the large-toothed rats. If he continued fighting, he was afraid that he would be bitten by these large-toothed rats until he became a skeleton. After Mu Hongyi and the others formed a defensive circle, the pressure on them decreased slightly. Even if they did not use their ultimate skills, they could still hold on for a while. Seeing that everyone was fighting so hard, Zhong Meng hesitated whether he should help them. If he did not help them, they would not be able to withstand the attacks of the large-toothed rats when they were exhausted. However, if he helped them, would it affect anything? After thinking for a while, Zhong Meng sighed helplessly. Since it was like this, he would help them. Thinking of this, Zhong Meng lightly punched the passage where the large-toothed rats were constantly pouring out. Just as Mu Hongyi was feeling a little desperate, he suddenly heard a loud noise. He looked over with the help of the dim red light and saw that the 2 passages in front of him had collapsed for no reason. The falling boulders had blocked the 2 passages. Seeing this situation, Mu Hongyi was immediately overjoyed. He knew that he was saved this time. After the battle just now, he had already seen that the reason why there were so many large-toothed rats in this large space was because a large number of large-toothed rats were constantly swarming out of the tunnel. Now that the 2 tunnels had collapsed for no reason, it meant that there were no more reinforcements coming from the large-toothed rats. Thinking of this, Mu Hongyi suddenly became spirited. He once again unleashed a consummate skill. After wiping out all the large-toothed rats in front of him, he shouted loudly, "Brothers, as long as we eliminate all the megalodon rats in this space, we will win." In fact, even if Mu Hongyi did not shout this, everyone understood after hearing the loud noise. Although there were many large-toothed rats in front of them, they would eventually be killed off. As long as these hateful large-toothed rats did not have any reinforcements, everything would be fine. After the tunnels collapsed, Everyone's spirits were lifted. Then, they began to cheer loudly. Although there were no more reinforcements from the large-toothed rats, there were still many of them. This battle went on for a long time before they were finally wiped out. Seeing that there were no longer any living large-toothed rats in the large space, everyone could not hold on any longer. They immediately found a slightly cleaner place and sat on the ground, panting heavily. Dazhai rested for a moment, then immediately took out the rest of the medicine. He quickly walked in front of Shenfeisha and said anxiously, "Old 5, let me treat your wounds." Hearing this, Shenfeisha was stunned. He looked at Dazhai in front of him and felt a little uncomfortable. In this battle, everyone was injured, and Dazhai was no exception. Although he had the bow with the broken string as a weapon, close combat was not his strength. Now, there were at least 5 or 6 wounds on his body. However, Dazhai did not treat his own wounds first. Instead, he treated his own wounds first. Shenfeisha felt very uncomfortable. He looked at Dazhai, who was full of concern, and said in a low voice, "I'm fine. You should treat your own wounds first." Dazhai shook his head, "Old 5, don't say any more. My wounds are fine. Your wounds are the most serious. Let me treat them for you first." As he spoke, Dazhai had already begun to treat Shenfeisha's wounds. Seeing Dazhai treating his own wounds, Shenfeisha felt his eyes become moist. He suddenly understood. Brothers were brothers. There was no need for rankings. If everyone respected you, even if you were the lowest ranking, everyone would still respect you. If everyone did not respect you, even if you were the big brother, no one would truly respect you. Thinking of this, Shenfeisha suddenly said, "Second brother, thank you." Dazhai, who was treating Shenfeisha's wounds, heard this and said with a smile, "Old 5, we're all brothers. There's no need to be so polite." Hearing this, Shenfeisha nodded heavily, "Second brother, I understand." After saying this, Shenfeisha thought to himself, "Second brother, I really understand." After Dazhai finished treating Shenfeisha's wounds, he took the medicine and went to Zhong Yundao and his brother to treat their wounds. Finally, he went to Mu Hongyi. "Big brother, let me treat your wounds too." Hearing this, Mu Hongyi shook his head, "Second brother, it's okay. My wounds are not serious. Come, let me treat your wounds." Seeing that Mu Hongyi's wounds were not serious, Dazhai nodded and handed over the medicine. Mu Hongyi took the medicine and began to treat Dazhai's wounds. "Second brother, why do you think the 2 passages suddenly collapsed?" Dazhai looked at the passage in front of him that was tightly covered and shook his head, "I don't know. Maybe it was too old and so many big rats rushed over and knocked down the rock." When Mu Hongyi heard this, he shook his head. "I don't think so. If the big mouse knocked down that rock, why did it knock down the rocks at the 2 entrances at the same time? This is a little puzzling." Hearing this, Dazhai was stunned and asked hesitantly, "Big brother, are you saying that someone helped us?" Mu Hongyi shook his head, "I don't know. According to this situation, someone should have helped us. But, in this space, we don't see any outsiders." Chapter 62. After Mu Hongyi finished treating Dazhai's wound, he walked towards the sealed passage. Before he reached the entrance of the passage, Mu Hongyi heard a squeaking sound coming from the passage. Hearing these sounds, Mu Hongyi's heart suddenly turned cold. Even if his martial arts were strong, after the battle just now, he did not dare to underestimate these weak large-toothed rats. Dazhai also walked over at this time. Hearing the sounds coming from the passage, he could not help but say, "Big brother, if these 2 boulders don't block the passage, I'm afraid we'll be in danger." Mu Hongyi nodded silently. The sounds of the large-toothed rats coming from the passage were not only mournful, but there were also many of them. If these large-toothed rats really continued to rush into the space, then the consequences would be really unimaginable. Mu Hongyi checked the situation of the 2 holes being covered, but he did not find any possibility of it being man-made. He could not help but feel even more puzzled. Could it be that it was really like what Dazhai said, that these rocks had collapsed naturally because it had been here for too long? Could there be such a coincidence? Dazhai walked behind Mu Hongyi and looked at the passage sealed by the rocks. He could not help but say, "Big brother, it looks like it really wasn't man-made. It should have collapsed naturally." Mu Hongyi nodded. Although he did not dare to believe that there could be such a coincidence in the world, the facts were right in front of him and he had no choice but to believe it. It looks like it's true. Hudaki said, "Big brother, our luck is really good. Such a coincidence actually happened at this critical moment. It's really a joyous occasion." The voices of the two men spread into the passage and caused countless large-toothed rats to squeak in the passage. Because there were too many squeaks, in the end, they were buzzing like flies. Fan Shouwu, who was almost drenched in sweat, saw Zhongmeng walking over and said with a laugh, "The fierce brothers, this battle was really enjoyable. I've never experienced such an enjoyable battle since I was young." Zhongmeng smiled when he heard this. "Do you want to have such an enjoyable battle again?" Hearing this, Fan Shouwu shook his head with a bitter smile. "No, I really don't want to have this kind of battle again. It's too dangerous." At this point, Fan Shouwu pointed at the collapsed tunnel in the distance and lamented, "If those two tunnels hadn't suddenly collapsed, I feel like I wouldn't have been able to hold on." Zhong Qiuming, who was sitting beside him, also nodded helplessly. That is indeed the case. If the two tunnels had not collapsed and sealed off the large-toothed rats that rushed out, I'm afraid that we would not have been able to leave today. Fan Shouwu nodded. "It's too dangerous. To be honest, I don't have much internal energy left. If the two tunnels don't collapse soon, I'm afraid." Haha. Zhong Qiuming wiped the sweat off his face and turned to look at old Luo. He smiled and said, "I still have to thank you for just now. If it weren't for your help, those large-toothed rats would have eaten me up long ago." Old Luo shook his head. "If it weren't for Prince Zhong fighting at the front, with just the few of us, I'm afraid that we wouldn't have been able to stop so many large-toothed rats." While the few of them were joking around, Zhong Qiuming suddenly lowered his voice and said, "Guess what Captain Mu will do next?" Fan Shouwu shook his head. "I don't know. However, I think that Lord Mu will bring us out of such a dangerous place." Zhong Qiuming shook his head and said in a low voice, "I don't think so. I heard their conversation just now. It seems that Lord Mu said that no matter what, he has to go in and take a look to see what's inside." Fan Shouwu heard this and shook his head. "I don't think so. To be honest, we should be in the outer area now. Think about it. The monsters in the outer area of the tunnel are already so powerful. How powerful would the monsters be inside?" At this point, Fan Shouwu paused for a moment before he continued, "Although Sir Mu's martial arts is powerful, I feel that after seeing these large-toothed rats, I'm afraid that he has given up on the idea of going in again." Zhong Qiuming shook his head. "Who knows? However, I'm guessing that Lord Mu will still go in." Fan Shouwu and Zhong Qiuming were discussing this matter. Mu Hongyi and Hudaki were also discussing this issue. Hudaki said, "Big brother, don't tell me you want to go in and take a look this time." Mu Hongyi heard this and looked at the large-toothed rats all over the ground. He was a little hesitant. If they went on, they might really be in danger. Not to mention other dangers, as long as the large-toothed rats in the tunnel were released, they would definitely not be able to get out alive. However, Mu Hongyi felt a little unwilling to give up this opportunity just like that. What should they do? Hudaki looked at the hesitant Mu Hongyi and thought for a moment before speaking. "Big brother, if you really want to go in and take a look, we can only wait. Let's send someone back to report to the Grand Commander and ask him to send more people to support us. I think that after the Grand Commander knows about this, he will definitely ask the elders to come forward. At that time, with the help of the elders, we shouldn't be in too much danger. Big brother, I think this is the best choice. If you go into the tunnel yourself, I'm afraid that you will be in danger." Mu Hongyi was silent for a long time when he heard this. Then, he nodded slightly and said with a sigh, "Since things have come to this, we can only do this." Speaking of this, Mu Hongyi glanced at the sealed tunnel again and said slowly, "We should think of a way to get out now. When we get out of the tunnel, we will immediately send someone back to report to the commander and let him make a decision." Hudaki was overjoyed when he heard this. "Big brother, since this is the case, let's quickly think of a way to get out." Mu Hongyi nodded and walked toward the crowd. Zhong Yundao saw his big brother coming over and quickly stood up to welcome him. "Big brother, how is the tunnel? What exactly caused it to collapse?" Mu Hongyi shook his head, then patted Zhong Yuntao's shoulder and said with a smile, "It seems that it was because we were lucky that the 2 tunnels collapsed at the critical moment." Zhong Yuntao nodded when he heard this. Although he didn't say anything, he didn't believe that the 2 tunnels collapsed at the critical moment because they were lucky. Even if they were lucky, it would be amazing if only one tunnel collapsed. How could both tunnels collapse? There must be a problem. However, since his big brother didn't want to talk about it, Zhong Yuntao naturally wouldn't talk about it. After thinking for a while, he asked, "Big brother, what should we do next? Should we continue to move forward or find a way to get out?" Chapter 63. When Mu Hongyi heard this, he sighed and said slowly, "That's right. The monsters here are not something we can deal with. Now we can only retreat first, pass this news back and wait for the commander's decision." Zhong Yuntao nodded. This was also the best choice. If they continued to rush blindly, they might be completely wiped out. This was definitely not an alarmist talk. Just like in the battle just now, if the 2 passages had not been sealed, then the only outcome would have been a complete wipeout. Since they had decided to retreat, they had to think of a way to do so. Mu Hongyi glanced at the situation in the big space and wanted to see which passage to take. The 2 passages behind them had been sealed by boulders. If they wanted to leave, they could only take the 2 passages opposite them. But where did those 2 passages lead to? No one knew. What would be in these 2 passages? No one knew either. After observing for a long time, he could not see which passage led to the outside world. Mu Hongyi hesitated again. He really just wanted to go out now. He just wanted to bring everyone out alive. If he wanted to go in and explore again, then that was his own business. Seeing his big brother hesitate, Zhong Yuntao suddenly spoke up. "Big brother, I think it's better if we give up the 2 passages in front and go back the way we came. What do you think?" Hudaki heard this and also said, "Yes, big brother, we don't know what monsters are in the 2 passages in front. I think if we go back the way we came, although the journey will be a little longer, at least it will be safe." After listening to the words of his 2 brothers, Mu Hongyi pondered for a while before nodding. "Well then, let's go back the way we came." Since they had decided to go back the way they came, everyone did not delay any longer. They immediately stood up and walked back the way they came. The people in front of them were still the 2 brothers, Zhong Yuntao and Lan Zhiyong. Everyone had already walked this path once. Relatively speaking, they were already very familiar with it. Moreover, there were no forks in this path. They just had to keep moving forward. Everyone had stayed in this dangerous place for long enough. They just wanted to get out as soon as possible. Naturally, their pace was much faster. Everyone moved forward. After losing the battle, they were not in the mood to talk. They just moved forward silently, wanting to get out of this dark passage as soon as possible. Although everyone could let their imaginations run wild, Zhong Yuntao and Lan Zhiyong, who were walking at the front, did not dare to do so. The 2 of them were tasked with exploring the path. Naturally, they did not dare to be careless. Along the way, they held steel knives in their hands and carefully explored the path in front of them. They did not dare to have the slightest carelessness. Just when everyone was in a hurry, Zhong Yuntao suddenly stopped. At the same time, he waved his hand behind him, indicating for everyone to stop. When the crowd saw Zhong Yuntao wave his hand, they were all shocked. They hurriedly stopped in their tracks. Just as they were about to ask, they saw Zhong Yuntao in front of them make a shushing gesture. Everyone was even more shocked. They hurriedly listened to the voice in front of them. "Piak, piak, 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 piak." When everyone heard this familiar voice, they were shocked. "Big bat." Judging from the source of the sound, there seemed to be a lot of big bat. When Mu Hongyi heard this voice, he was a little confused. There were no giant bats along the way, so why would there be such a sound now? Thinking of this, Mu Hongyi suddenly remembered what had happened in the large space with the large-toothed rats. Originally, there were not many large-toothed rats in the large space. However, when everyone rushed in, countless large-toothed rats came out of the passage. Could it be that the situation in the large space with the giant bats was the same? If that was really the case, it would be terrible. Thinking of this, Mu Hongyi hurriedly walked forward to Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong and said in a low voice, "Come, follow me to the front to take a look." When Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong heard this, they nodded and followed Mu Hongyi forward. After walking for a while, the slapping sound became louder. Mu Hongyi's face was a little pale. He felt that what he had guessed just now might be true. The three of them walked carefully, not daring to make any sound. Even their breathing was suppressed as much as possible, for fear of alarming the giant bats in front of them. Hearing the slapping sound in front of them getting louder and more frequent, Mu Hongyi suddenly waved his hand at Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong behind him and pointed to the back. Then, he carefully walked back the way he came. When Zhong Yundao and Lan Zhiyong saw that their big brother had retreated, they did not dare to delay and hurriedly followed Mu Hongyi's footsteps. They walked all the way back and finally returned to their original position. When Hudaki saw that Mu Hongyi had returned, he hurriedly went forward to greet him. Just as he was about to ask, he saw Mu Hongyi waving his hand vigorously at him and making a gesture to keep quiet. He could not help but feel a little strange, but he did not dare to ask again. Mu Hongyi walked in front of everyone, stretched out his arm and waved at everyone. Then, he took the lead and walked back the way he came. When everyone saw Mu Hongyi's cautious look, they knew that the situation was not good. At this time, no one dared to speak. Seeing that Mu Hongyi had retreated, they hurriedly followed behind him and walked back the way they came. Everyone walked quickly and soon returned to the large space with the large-toothed rats. At this time, the large-toothed rats inside were sealed and could not come out. Therefore, there were no large-toothed rats in the large space. Seeing this situation, Mu Hongyi was slightly relieved. He turned his head to look at everyone and said in a low voice, "We can't go back the way we came. Although I didn't walk into that space, I felt that there must be a lot of bats over there from the sounds made by those large bats. If we go from there, we might encounter the same danger as here. That's why I brought everyone back here. At least it's safer here. Let's discuss a plan here and then decide which way to go." When everyone heard this, they finally understood why Mu Hongyi had quietly brought them back. When Shen Feisha heard Mu Hongyi's words, he was shocked. Others did not know how powerful the bat space was, but he had seen it with his own eyes. The large bat swarm that covered the sky almost filled the large space. If those countless large bats rushed toward everyone, Shen Feisha could be sure that no one would be able to escape if this situation really happened. Although the large-toothed rats were terrifying, the large-toothed rats ran on the ground after all. Their attacks could still be traced. At least they would not leave the ground. However, the attacks of those large bats were different. These large bats could fly, and they flew very fast. When they attacked the enemy, they would attack the enemy from all directions without any blind spots. Chapter 64. Mu Hongyi led everyone back to the space of the large-toothed rats. He looked at the two tunnels in front of him and began to ponder. Which tunnel should he choose? Now, he no longer had the idea of exploring. Mu Hongyi only wanted to find a safe tunnel and return to the outside as soon as possible. There were two tunnels on the opposite side. Mu Hongyi guessed that one of them should lead to the outside. As for the other tunnel, it was hard to say. It might lead to somewhere else. If they went the wrong way, they would definitely encounter monsters. If they encountered a tide of large-toothed rats, it would be terrible. Mu Hongyi did not believe that he would be so lucky as to escape the fangs of the large-toothed rats. Looking at the two tunnels on the opposite side, everyone was hesitant. After these few battles, everyone was very clear that if they went the wrong way, they would definitely encounter a large number of monsters in the tunnel. When that time came, it would be hard to say if they could get out alive. If it was when they had just entered the tunnel, Mu Hongyi would definitely have the ability to make a decisive decision. However, after this battle, Mu Hongyi had become less decisive. He knew that his decision would directly determine everyone's life and death. If they chose the wrong tunnel in front of them, the chances of getting out alive were really too slim. Thinking of this, Mu Hongyi strode to the front of the two tunnels and carefully observed the movements in the tunnels. He wanted to see if he could find any problems. However, unfortunately, the two tunnels were basically the same. It was almost impossible to find any problems from the outside. Mu Hongyi once again fell into hesitation. He was afraid that he would make a mistake in his command and cause everyone to fall into a desperate situation. Everyone was sizing up the two tunnels. After a long while, Hudaki suddenly said, "Big brother, since we have no choice, why don't you let me explore the path in front? After confirming that there is no danger in front, you all can enter the tunnel." Hearing this, Mu Hongyi thought for a while and nodded. "All right then, it's good that you go and take a look. How about this? I'll let Zhong Yundao go with you. If there is any danger, you can take care of each other." Hearing this, Hudaki knew that now was not the time to be stubborn. He nodded. "All right, big brother, I'll go then." As he spoke, Hudaki had already taken the lead and walked into one of the tunnels. He did not deliberately choose it. He just randomly chose a tunnel and walked in. There was no need to choose. If he knew which passage was the safest, everyone would not hesitate. Zhong Yundao did not dare to be negligent. He hurriedly strode forward and chased after him. Hudaki held the broken bow and arrow in his hand and walked forward carefully. He did not dare to make too much noise. If there were any remaining large-toothed rats here, they would definitely swarm over after hearing his voice. Fortunately, Hudaki walked for a long time and did not find any megalodon rats. However, he found a new problem. Hudaki stopped and looked at the crossroads in front of him. He was a little puzzled. At this time, Zhong Yundao also came forward and asked in a low voice, "Second brother, the situation here is not good." Hudaki nodded, but his gaze never left the crossroads in front of him. There were a total of 3 forks, and all of them were the same. Hudaki had already seen this clearly, and it was precisely because of this that Hudaki was a little hesitant. In the end, Hudaki decided to choose the middle tunnel. Because, according to the tunnel that they came from, only the middle tunnel could be connected to the tunnel that they came from. Thinking of this, Hudaki turned to look at Zhong Yundao and said in a low voice, "We will walk in the middle. When we leave later, you must be very careful. I feel that this tunnel is a little different from the one that we were in just now." Zhong Yundao nodded. "Second brother, don't worry." Hearing this, Hudaki raised the broken bow in his hand and walked towards the middle tunnel. The tunnel was very quiet. There was no sound at all. There were only a few droplets of water condensed due to the humidity. They dripped onto the rock surface and made a crisp sound. Looking at the dark tunnel in front of him, although Hudaki could not hear anything, he still felt a sense of danger surrounding him. Hudaki tried his best to open his eyes, wanting to see where this sense of danger came from. Unfortunately, he could not see anything. In front of him, there were only dark grey rocks. Other than rocks, there was nothing else. This invisible pressure was even more terrifying than a head-on battle. After walking for a short distance, Hudaki felt uncomfortably hot. He wiped the sweat on his forehead. It was also at this moment that he suddenly heard a weak sound. Gu. The sound was very soft, but in the silent tunnel, Hudaki could still hear it clearly. What is this sound? Hudaki was a little puzzled. This sound was definitely not made by the big rats or the big bats. Then what could it be? Although there was a sound in front of him, which proved that there was definitely a monster ahead, Hudaki was just a scout. If he only heard the sound and retreated, it would be a little too disgraceful. Hudaki took a deep breath, lightened his footsteps, and walked forward. After walking for a while, Hudaki felt that there were more sounds coming from inside. It was also at this moment that Hudaki suddenly realized that there were forks on both sides of the tunnel in front of him. When Hudaki saw the forks on both sides of the tunnel, he became even more nervous. He grabbed the bow with a broken string and carefully walked towards the fork in front of him. Just as Hudaki was about to enter the fork, he suddenly felt a gust of wind in front of him. The sound of the wind came so fast that it gave Hudaki a fright. He hurriedly used all his strength to stand up and lean back. It was at this moment that something that looked like a long whip shot out from where his body was originally standing. Very quickly, it retracted back into the dark fork. Seeing this change, more cold sweat flowed down Hudaki's forehead. He hurriedly took a few steps back and avoided the fork. At the same time, he raised the bow with a broken string in his hand and made a defensive posture. Zhong Yundao saw that the situation was bad and hurriedly walked to Hudaki's side. He raised the saber in his hand in front of him and looked ahead vigilantly. The two of them were in a defensive posture, afraid that countless monsters would rush out from the darkness. However, the two of them waited for a long time, but no monsters rushed out from the darkness. Hudaki glanced at Zhong Yundao and said in a low voice, "I'll go ahead and take a look." "Wait for me here." Zhong Yundao nodded. At the same time, he gripped the saber even harder. Although Zhong Yundao was behind, his task was also very difficult. If Hudaki encountered danger in front, he would have to rely on him to save him. Chapter 65. Hudaki carefully walked towards the fork in the passage. He didn't dare to be careless. Who knew what kind of monster was hiding in the dark fork? Hudaki stared straight ahead, afraid that the monster would suddenly attack again. Just as Hudaki approached the fork in the road, another black shadow flew towards him like a bolt of lightning. Hudaki didn't know what was flying towards him, so he naturally didn't dare to take it head-on. He hurriedly retreated and dodged the attack. Hudaki saw that he had dodged the sneak attack in the dark. Just as he was about to move forward to check again, he suddenly heard a sizzling sound coming from his side. Hudaki was shocked and hurriedly turned his head to look. He was shocked to find that a ball of green mucus was sticking to the rock next to him. This ball of green mucus was constantly corroding the rock. The sizzling sound was the sound of the mucus corroding the rock. Seeing this scene, Hudaki was so shocked that his scalp went numb. He was secretly afraid. If he had been hit by this ball of mucus, Hudaki didn't believe that he would be stronger than the rock. After a short while, the corroded rock stopped making any noise. Only a large dent was left where the mucus had hit. Hudaki wiped the cold sweat on his forehead. He felt that his palms were cold. He subconsciously took a few steps back and returned to Zhong Yuntao's side. He lowered his voice and said, "Be careful. Be careful later. Don't get sprayed by that thing." Zhong Yundao nodded. The rock that was sprayed by the mucus wasn't far from him. He naturally saw everything that happened just now. Seeing that the ball of mucus had such a strong corrosive power, Zhong Yundao was so shocked that his heart turned cold. At this time, when he heard Hudaki mention it, he hurriedly nodded in response. "Second brother, I understand." After a while, Hudaki calmed down and walked forward again towards the fork in front of him. This time, Hudaki changed his tactics. He took out an arrow from behind him and held it in his hand. At the same time, he raised it above his head and looked like he was ready to shoot at any time. As he approached the fork, Hudaki became even more cautious. He moved his feet slowly, and as soon as he reached the front of the fork, he immediately let out a roar. Then, he quickly threw the arrow in his hand. After Hudaki threw the arrow in his hand, he immediately stomped on the ground and retreated like lightning. At the same time, a black shadow shot out from the darkness, streaking across the void and brushing past Hudaki's back. Hudaki had just dodged the attack when he heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the dark tunnel. Cuckoo! After hearing this scream, Hudaki was immediately overjoyed. He knew that the arrow he had just thrown must have hit the monster in the darkness. Otherwise, its scream would not have been so mournful. After hearing this scream, Hudaki hurriedly stopped. Just as he was about to turn around, an underground poisonous frog with arrows pierced through its body jumped out from the fork. As soon as the underground poison frog jumped out, it immediately opened its mouth and its tongue flew out like lightning towards Hudaki. Zhong Yundao saw that the situation was not good. He quickly stepped forward and waved the steel knife in his hand, chopping at the underground poison frog's tongue. Zhong Yuntao's martial arts skills were high and his strength was great. When the knife landed on the underground poison frog's tongue, it was immediately cut off. Cuckoo! With its tongue cut off, the underground poison frog let out another blood-curdling scream. It suddenly opened its mouth and spat out a mouthful of mucus. Then, it turned around and jumped hard, disappearing in front of the fork. At this time, Hudaki had already turned around. When he saw the underground poison frog spit out venom, he was almost scared out of his wits. He immediately exerted force on his feet and quickly retreated to the side. When Zhong Yundao saw this ball of mucus, he naturally did not dare to be careless. He also quickly moved away and hid far away. As the two of them dodged with all their might, the underground poison frog's venom did not hurt anyone and flew far away. After dodging the attack of the ball of mucus, Hudaki hurriedly turned his head and looked in the direction of the underground poison frog. However, at the fork, the underground poison frog had already disappeared. Seeing that the underground poison frog had escaped, Hudaki and Zhong Yundao looked at each other and secretly rejoiced that they had dodged quickly. Otherwise, if they were hit by that ball of mucus, they would definitely be dead. The two of them calmed down a little. Zhong Yundao went forward and picked up the tongue that he had cut off. He looked at it and asked curiously, "Second brother, what do you think this is?" Hudaki looked at the half of the tongue in Zhong Yuntao's hand. Just as he was about to shake his head, he suddenly thought of something. "I know, this thing must be that monster's tongue. Only then would the monster cry out so miserably after you cut it off." Hearing this, Zhong Yundao looked at it again and nodded. "Indeed, this really does look like a tongue. Although I have never seen such a big tongue, I could vaguely see that this thing was spat out from that thing's mouth." Hudaki thought for a while and said slowly, "Not only that, third brother, why does that monster look like a big frog?" Zhong Yundao also nodded. "It does look like one. Not only does it look like one, but when it came out and when it escaped, it jumped instead of walking. I think only things like frogs would jump." Hudaki nodded and took out an arrow from behind him. He turned to Zhong Yundao and said, "I'll go ahead and see if there are any more monsters there." Zhong Yundao nodded and raised the steel sword in his hand. He was ready to go forward and support at any time. It was still the same old plan. As soon as Hudaki walked out of the fork, he immediately threw the arrow in his hand into the darkness and immediately retreated again. This time, there was no attack from the darkness, nor was there a scream. After waiting for a while, Hudaki was sure that the monster should have been injured and ran away. Hudaki walked towards the dark fork again. Although there was no sound from the fork, Hudaki still did not dare to be careless. The attack of the monster's tongue was secondary. The main thing was that the mucus it spat out was too powerful. As long as he was hit by that mucus, there was basically no hope for him. Hudaki carefully went forward to search. Zhong Yundao did not dare to be negligent. He walked behind Hudaki, afraid that something unexpected would happen. Hudaki slowly walked to the opposite side of the fork and stabilized his body. There was nothing attacking him from the fork. After waiting for a while, Hudaki was completely relieved. The big monster really ran away. Chapter 66. Hudaki was slightly relieved when he saw that there were no more monsters in the fork. He turned to look at Zhong Yundao behind him and said in a low voice, "It seems that the monster ran away." Zhong Yundao nodded. "Second brother, are we going to continue?" Hudaki turned his head and looked at the tunnel in front of him. He thought for a moment and nodded. "We don't know what's in front of us. Why don't we go a little further and decide if we want to continue?" Zhong Yundao nodded. "Okay, in that case, I'll take the lead this time." Hudaki shook his head. "Let me do it. We don't know what monsters are in front of us." Zhong Yundao raised the sword in his hand and said with a smile, "Second brother, your weapon is not as good as mine. If there are monsters in front of us, my sword can at least cut off their tongues. I don't think your weapon will work. Let me scout ahead." Hudaki thought for a moment and agreed. His bow had a broken string. Even if he encountered monsters, he could only repel them and not cause any damage. Thinking of this, Hudaki nodded and said, "Okay, you scout ahead. But you have to be careful. The mucus that the monster spits out is too strong. Don't get hit by it." Zhong Yundao nodded. "Second brother, I know. I'll be careful." While speaking, Zhong Yundao gripped the steel sword in his hand and walked forward. Zhong Yundao walked forward. Before long, he saw two more forks in the rock wall in front of him. He was shocked. The two forks in front of them were not on the same side of the rock wall, but on opposite sides of the rock wall. Although they were slightly separated, the two forks could still see each other. If there was only one fork, it would be fine. Even if there were monsters in the fork, they could only attack from one side. Now that the two forks were on both sides of the tunnel, it was very difficult to deal with. If he walked to the middle of the fork, he would be attacked from both sides. This was very difficult to deal with. He might even be hit by monsters from one side. Looking at the two forks, Zhong Yuntao's forehead was covered in cold sweat. How should he get through? However, since he was already here, he had to find a way to get past it. Thinking of this, Zhong Yundao took a deep breath and clenched the steel saber in his hand. Then, he slowly walked forward toward the two passageways in front of him. At this moment, Dazhai, who had been walking behind, suddenly took a few steps forward and grabbed Zhong Yuntao's shoulder, stopping him from moving forward. Zhong Yundao turned his head and saw that Dazhai was slowly taking off his coat. He suddenly understood Dazhai's idea and was overjoyed. He hurriedly gave Dazhai a thumbs up to express his admiration. Seeing this, Dazhai only smiled. Then, he took off his coat and hung it on the broken bow. After finishing these actions, Dazhai turned to look at Zhong Yundao and gestured for him to get ready. Seeing this, Zhong Yundao hurriedly nodded, indicating that he understood. Only then did Dazhai challenge his coat with the broken bowstring and explore the path in front of the fork. Seeing the coat slowly approaching the fork, the two nervously held their breaths and stared at the two forks in front of them. Just as Dazhai picked up the coat in front of the fork, the two underground poison frogs hiding at the two forks immediately launched an attack. The underground poison frog hiding closer to the coat immediately opened its mouth and spat out a mouthful of venom. As for the underground poison frog further away, because of its distance, it only flicked out its tongue. Seeing that the two attacks from the left and right hit the coat, Dazhai did not dare to be negligent. He hurriedly took out the arrow in his right hand and threw it towards the dark fork that spat out the venom. Gu. Immediately, a scream came from the dark fork. Dazhai was overjoyed. Just as he was about to go forward and end it, unexpectedly, the underground poison frog hiding in the fork suddenly jumped out. It opened its mouth and shot out its tongue, hitting Dazhai's body like lightning. Caught off guard, Dazhai was hit and immediately felt a burst of pain. It was so painful that he could not help but groan. His body was also hit back 2 steps before he could stabilize himself. But this was not the end. Just as Dazhai steadied himself, he felt that the big tongue that hit him was dragging him towards the big frog. Dazhai was shocked. If he was dragged over by the tongue and the big frog spat out another mouthful of venom, it would be too late. Thinking of this, Dazhai did not care much. He hurriedly grabbed the broken bow and smashed it towards the big tongue. But this was useless. Even if the broken bow could be used as an iron rod, it could not be used as a knife. Although he hit it hard, it only made the big frog scream. His body was still being dragged forward. Zhong Yundao, who was originally looking at the other fork, saw that the situation was not good. He hurriedly backhanded his knife and cut off the big frog's tongue. After the big frog's tongue was cut off, Dazhai had just stabilized himself and immediately jumped to the side to dodge. Just as Dazhai's figure dodged, the big frog whose tongue was cut off had already spat out a mouthful of venom. It brushed past him and flew past. Dazhai had just dodged the big frog's attack and he immediately growled, "Die for me." As he spoke, Dazhai had already used all his strength to throw the broken bow in his hand towards the big frog. Dazhai was an archer. Naturally, his accuracy was not to be questioned. Coupled with his strong inner force, when he used all his strength, how could he be underestimated? The broken bow that Dazhai threw was like lightning. It pierced through the big frog's mouth and came out from the back of its head. It was stuck there just like that. Seeing this, Zhong Yundao naturally did not dare to be negligent. He hurriedly took a few steps forward and came in front of the big frog. He waved the steel knife in his hand and slashed 5 times at lightning speed. Then, he stepped hard on the ground and retreated in a flash. Croak, croak. The giant frog that was slashed by Zhong Yundao immediately let out continuous blood-curdling screams. At this moment, the attack from the other fork also arrived. Just as Zhong Yundao retreated, a ball of mucus flew out from the darkness. However, when Zhong Yundao retreated, the ball of mucus hit the big frog's body. Croak, croak. After the big frog was hit by the ball of mucus, it suddenly let out a strange scream. In just a moment, the big frog's scream stopped. Its huge body also fell to the ground and did not move anymore. Chapter 67. Hudarki and Zhong Yundao let out a long sigh of relief when they saw the underground poison frog fall. However, they still didn't dare to let down their guard because there was another big frog hidden at the other side of the fork. Hudarki walked to the side of the wall and took out an arrow. He hooked the clothes he threw away on the ground and slowly pulled it back. After retrieving the clothes, Hudarki reached out and picked it up. He looked at it and found that the place where the venom sprayed had already corroded a big hole. Looking at the corroded hole, Hudarki thought for a moment and folded the clothes again. He then took out 2 arrows and placed them on the left and right sides of the clothes, forming something like a flag. Zhong Yundao saw this and immediately understood Hudarki's idea. He hurriedly lowered his voice and asked, "Second brother, do you want to rush up like this?" Hudarki nodded. "I've been paying attention just now. Although the venom is very corrosive, it didn't penetrate the clothes after hitting it. So, I want to try." Zhong Yundao heard this and immediately became anxious. If Hudarki succeeded, it would be fine. If he failed, wouldn't he die without a doubt? Hudarki saw that Zhong Yundao still wanted to persuade him and waved his hand. "I'm just trying. It doesn't matter. Don't worry, I'll be careful." After saying this, Hudarki didn't wait for Zhong Yundao to answer. He picked up the clothes with one hand and an arrow with the other hand and walked towards the fork in the road ahead. Zhong Yundao saw that it was useless to persuade him anymore. He could only carry the steel knife and walk closely behind Hudarki, ready to support him at any time. Although Hudarki said it casually, he was actually very nervous. He also knew very well that if the poison attack of the giant frog could penetrate the clothes, then he would be finished. It could be said that he was only separated from death by a piece of clothes. Hudarki picked up the clothes in his hand and stared at the front with his eyes wide open. As long as he walked to the front of the fork, he would definitely not hesitate and immediately throw the arrow in his hand. At this time, the passage was very quiet. Hudarki felt that only his heartbeat was left in this passage, constantly echoing in his ears. Just as Hudarki walked to the side of the fork in the passage, the underground poison frog hiding inside launched an attack. A ball of mucus flew out from the darkness and hit Hudarki's clothes, but it did not make any sound. Hudarki only felt his clothes tremble violently for a moment before everything returned to normal. At this moment, Hudarki didn't dare to be negligent. Almost subconsciously, he quickly threw out the arrow in his hand. Not only that, as soon as the arrow left his hand, he immediately took out another arrow and threw it out. Cuckoo! A few screams immediately came from the dark fork. Just as Hudarki was about to go forward, he suddenly realized that the clothes in front of him had been corroded and had a big hole. Seeing this, Hudarki didn't dare to move forward anymore. If the giant frog launched another venom attack at this time, there would be nothing to block it. Just now, Hudarki had been able to challenge the giant frog with the clothes covering his body. Now that there was nothing blocking him, Hudarki would be courting death if he went up to challenge the giant frog. Hudarki looked at the big hole in his clothes and didn't dare to be negligent. He hurriedly took 2 steps back, away from the threat of the fork in the passage. Although Hudarki had retreated, Zhong Yundao didn't dare to be negligent. Just now, the underground poison frog jumped out angrily because it was shot by Hudarki's arrow. It wanted to take revenge. Zhong Yundao stared at the entrance of the passage, afraid that the underground poison frog would suddenly run out and spray venom at the 2 of them. However, after waiting for a while, the 2 of them didn't see any underground poison frog running out from the fork in the passage ahead. They couldn't help but feel puzzled. "Second brother, was that big frog killed by the arrow you threw just now?" Hearing this, Hudarki shook his head. "I don't know. It was dark inside and I couldn't see anything. I could only hear the giant frog's screams, but I don't know where it was shot." After waiting for a while, there was still no movement in front of them. Zhong Yundao couldn't help but smile. "Second brother, it seems that the giant frog was either shot to death or scared away by you." Hudarki shook his head. "Don't be careless. It's better to be careful." Hearing this, Zhong Yundao looked at the fork in front and said in a low voice, "Second brother, why don't you wait for me here and I'll go there and take a look?" Hudarki shook his head. "No, if that giant frog has been hiding inside, Wouldn't that be terrible? Hearing this, Zhong Yundao felt a chill in his heart. He couldn't help but ask, "Second brother, what should we do?" Hudaki looked at the fork in front of him and kept thinking of a solution in his heart. It was impossible to not go to the front and take a look. They couldn't keep wasting time here. How could they get there? Hudaki looked around and suddenly saw the giant frog on the ground. His heart suddenly moved. He hurriedly turned his head to look at Zhong Yundao and said in a low voice, "Wait a minute, I'll throw that giant frog over. If there's still a giant frog in the fork, it will definitely attack it." Hearing this, Zhong Yundao nodded and put the steel saber back into the scabbard. He said with a smile, "Second brother, let me do it this time." Hudaki nodded, "Okay, you have to be more careful." Zhong Yundao smiled and turned his head to look at the fork in front of him. Then he looked at the giant frog on the ground. He thought for a moment and immediately took a deep breath. Then he jumped forward and jumped in front of the giant frog. He reached out and grabbed the giant frog and threw it toward the fork in front of him. As soon as Zhong Yundao threw the giant frog in his hand, he immediately jumped back. As for the situation at the fork, with the giant frog in the air blocking him, he couldn't see it. It was useless to stay there any longer. Although Zhong Yundao couldn't see the situation at the fork, Hudaki could see it very clearly. As soon as Zhong Yundao threw the giant frog over, Hudaki saw a black shadow fly out from the fork and hit the giant frog that flew over. In just a moment, the giant frog that was still in the air was corroded and emitted a white gas. Seeing this situation, Hudaki's heart was filled with horror. If he had rushed over blindly just now, then the giant frog's venom attack would have hit both of them. Zhong Yundao, who had retreated, was secretly glad. Just now, if his second brother didn't stop him from going forward to investigate, then he would have been hit by this ball of venom. Thinking of the consequences of being hit by this ball of venom, Zhong Yundao only felt a chill in his heart. He couldn't help but shiver. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.